park to remove their masks when taking pictures outdoors, including with characters, so including when you're posing with, for instance, Mickey Mouse, etc. In national political news, the chief prosecution investigator at the trial of Derek Chauvin has reversed part of his evidence. In a film from the death of George Floyd, the prosecutor had originally referenced Floyd as saying, quote, "I ate too many drugs," end quote, but has since revised the statement as Floyd saying, quote, "I ain't done no drugs," end quote. Defense is arguing that the main cause of Floyd's death was drug use, with the prosecution arguing that the cause of death was Derek Chauvin's knee being pressed against Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. And this comes as earlier this week, the blue wall, the blue shield that, police officers usually tend to protect each other, that wall has been crumbling with the week opening with Minneapolis Police Chief Dario Arredondo basically condemning Chauvin and coming down on him for his decisions. And it was followed up by expert testimony from people, studying and very familiar with the use of force, experts on the use of force, and also the person who had taught Chauvin how to do that knee to neck hold, that exact hold, saying that he had done it wrong. Anyway, we're going to be talking about this later on in the show with Garland Nixon. That's coming up at 8:15 a.m. Eastern. President Biden will unveil 6 executive actions on gun control and gun violence today, specifically aimed at restricting the use of ghost guns, attempting to get more states to introduce red flag laws, and restricting the use of modified pistols. The Department of Justice is also expected to issue its first comprehensive report on gun trafficking in over 20 years, since the year 2000. Ghost guns, by the way, are guns made untraceable by the lack of a serial number, usually produced from kits containing most of the components of guns, along with assembly instructions for those components. Within 60 days, the Department of Justice is expected to release model legislation for states on red flag laws, which will allow police or family members to petition courts to remove firearms from people in a state of crisis. And within 60 days, the DOJ would also issue a proposed rule that would allow pistols equipped with a brace or other stabilizing device to be reclassified as short-barreled rifles. That would make them subject to the requirements of the National Firearms Act. Biden is also set to nominate David Chipman to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Chipman is noted as a sort of gun safety, I wouldn't say activist, but as having been vocal in the past in favor of gun safety. In other words, in favor of various forms of gun control. In an article published at the Washington Post yesterday, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia wrote that there is, quote, I'm quoting here, there is no circumstance, end quote, in which he would vote to eliminate or weaken the filibuster, also saying that he does, quote, not believe budget reconciliation should replace regular order. Continue quoting from another part of the article. Every time the Senate voted to weaken the filibuster in the past decade, the political dysfunction and gridlock have grown more severe, end quote. Manchin wrote that, going on to say that, quote, generations of senators who came before us put their heads down and their pride aside to solve the complex issues facing our country. We must do the same, end quote. And in my own way, I kind of agree with him, Jamarl, but I'm guessing you're really not fond of this dude at this point, because he's the one who's holding them back. He's the useful excuse, or potentially the actual obstacle in the way of getting the filibuster undone, getting this infrastructure bill from being passed. What's your take, Jamarl?
Manchin is not depicting reality in the way that reality is. Meaning, at one point, you had a situation where the filibuster was used rarely. And it was used rarely because it stopped all business of Congress. Meaning, back in I believe it was the 70s, or whenever the filibuster started, initially was in use, it would be few and far between. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but few and far between. Because what would happen is the moment that somebody calls a filibuster, all business stops. Everything stops. It's not like you can have multiple segments of Congress moving in the Senate. No, all business stops. So eventually, when they made the filibuster easier, and when they made it much more available, well, what happens? It starts to be used more. And not just being used more, it becomes the normal way of business, where this is just how things go. And if you want to get anything accomplished, you need 60 votes. That is not the way it was meant to function. That is not the way Congress was meant to function. The Senate already has an advantage in regards to the smaller elements, the minority party. You get 2 votes from California, just like you get 2 votes from Iowa. It means that Iowa has an advantage in that situation that it wouldn't have in a typical one man, one vote scenario. That is the entire point and thought of the Senate. If we're going to add the secondary factor that wasn't meant to be there, just because the political actors have gotten to the point where America matters radically less, as opposed to being loyal opposition, well, yeah, it's not insane for people like me to say that's not the way it was supposed to be used. And if that is the way it is going to be used, maybe it shouldn't exist. That's where I'm at. And so other countries, parliamentarians, have the capacity to function, and they do perfectly fine with this notion of, let's say the UK, for example. They have a parliament, they have a House of Lords. You have a parliament that one man, one vote, yes, but for the most part, they aggregate themselves into this notion that this party is backing this policy and this runs. Well, the U.S. could do the same thing. And in the same way, it's not deleterious to the effects of various parliaments around the world. An argument can't be made to me that this is also deleterious to us to get rid of that particular thing that is standing in the way of any policies getting done. And by the way, that still doesn't stop Joe Biden from saying, I don't want to back this or I do want to back this. It would just make him to be the deciding factor, something that he doesn't want to be. So yes, Joe Manchin is wrong. Joe Manchin is full of it. And at the end of the day, the filibuster needs to be destroyed. That's where I'm at.
I hear you on that, but doesn't that set the Republicans up for their own sweeping legislative reforms on the other side when they win? Isn't that the immediate thing that comes up?
It does, but that can't be the justification for not doing stuff. I'm making a point that in the same way that Democrats get the run of it, Republicans will get the run of it. That's politics. That's just how every other system works.
I'll be honest. While we're already in a tailspin, taking one wing off the plane and switching which wing is off which plane as you're flying down is only going to destabilize it further. If anything, and I'm going to be frank here, unless you see a strong leader, some sort of strong reformist coming in, the more that we do to try to halt this baby from hitting the cliff bottom, in a weird way, the faster we're going to make it go down. And so if you undo the filibuster, I can see over coming decades, quick switches every couple of years or potentially more often if you see more regular impeachments and some successful ones, quick switches between what on the highest level our country is choosing to do. And that seems like that's only going to be bad for the states and the people who live in it.
Those are unknowns. And you're putting a lot of stuff into it that
you can say
it's
that,
impossible to know. I'm only talking about what's real and what's known. And to make the argument that, well, later on, it may flip back and forth, I don't know that. And later on, there'll be successive impeachments. I don't know that either.
I'm a person with the brain who can predict things pretty simply, and this is where
no, nonsense. That framing is nonsense. That framing is nonsense. A person with a brain that can predict things, meaning that if somebody is taking an alternate point of view from what I'm saying, that is all of a sudden them not having a brain and not predicting things well.
You're saying that I can't predict things. You're saying, okay, Shane, whoa, you're predicting things here. That's out of bounds. No,
I said it's unknowable.
I can do that.
I said it's unknowable.
Okay, but we can have a conversation. About what's probable, and that's what I'm doing.
But that's my point, Shane. That's not probable. You don't know that. You're making assumptions that what you're thinking is probable, and I'm saying you don't know that. How do you know that there's going to be successful impeachments back and forth? You don't know that, and you don't even know whether or not the Congress is going to flip back and forth. Well, Congress stayed with Democrats for 50 years.
In the last four presidents, we've seen 2 impeachments. That's a historical irregularity. So even just looking at it statistically, the likelihood that we're going to see more impeachments of presidents soon seems to be going up. Furthermore, is it not just me, but don't we have historical rising levels of political division in our country? And don't we talk all the time about how as each party has come in over the last couple of presidencies, all that the president has tried to do effectively is strike back against the legacy of the president who preceded him? I mean, all this stuff is pretty simple, man. It seems to just fit the facts.
I don't think it necessarily fits the facts. I mean, and not to mention, we're talking about a significant change. We're talking about getting rid of the filibuster. What effect would that have? Is it possible that removing the filibuster has this effect where one party is able to actually get something accomplished and the public is okay with it? I mean, I keep saying Democrats had the House for 50 years at one point. And it changed with Bill Clinton. I guess I'm making the point it's hard to look at the political space and make these proclamations like that. And I don't necessarily think it's there for it to be able to do that. I mean, whether you realize it or not, Republicans learned a lesson when they tried to impeach Bill Clinton.
I'll put it like this: if the Democratic Party were ascendant again and getting what they want done, you would have double-digit percentages of the American public who pretty much at every turn would be like, I don't like that. That's how it looks from here, and it seems less probable to me that the American public would suddenly fall in line than that they wouldn't, and you'd simply see an acceleration of our problems based on how things are going. Again, looking at it sort of statistically in a trend line sense. That seems to be where it would take us.
Well, be specific for me. What policies that these guys will push that the American public would be like, you know what, I'm not for that? What would be the policy?
Take the Green New Deal, for instance. Take the Green New Deal and this sort of larger infrastructure plan that Biden is pushing. If the Democrats were to have a perceived mandate, or at least if they were to get rid of the filibuster to the point where they could do what they wanted, you would have, on the one hand, significant investments, a lot of money being thrown into the pot, a lot of money being used, and you would see that visibly. But at the same time, they would raise taxes, and it probably wouldn't end with corporate taxes. It would probably end with other kinds of taxes. And there are some people who either out of ideology don't want their taxes to be raised, or who wouldn't be the beneficiaries of those infrastructure investments, who might live in other parts of the country, et cetera. That's the simple one that comes immediately to mind. But I could see, okay, there are plenty of cases, even universal health care. You would think Obamacare, again, not universal health care, Obamacare, an unmitigated good. But was it, or was it actually kind of widely disliked by Republicans when it was introduced, widely made fun of, and that has persisted to this day? It seems like pretty much any policy that one party puts forward, unless it's, I don't even know what it is. Even our COVID lockdown, our COVID response was, received pretty variably by different branches of the public. I can't name one that would. I guess I would ask you to name one that would buy everybody over.
Well, I mean, the goal is not buy everybody over. I've never made that standard. I'm talking about the majority. And honestly, even Obamacare, if you want to use that, is a majority plus, meaning the majority of the public is on board for that. Even with me, with all of the things that I have issues with it, I still have to accept that the majority of the public agrees with it, especially in contrast to what the previous scenario was. I mean, for God's sake, I could go through the list. In unions, for example, Joe Biden keeps talking about unions. Well, you have, 60 to 70% of the public that backs unions? If you say $15 now minimum wage, well, Biden kept talking about it. The House pushed forward, even though Manchin wasn't for it. But again, that's 67% of the public. I'm making the point that it's not straightforward to say that if Democrats got what they want, all of a sudden the Congress or the public will be, perturbed by that and flip it. I don't think that's legit. I'm not going to make those predictions of saying
no, but if that's Democrats got it. That's not what I was saying either. To be clear.
Okay. Okay. Well, it sounded like you were making a point that says if Democrats got what they want, that the public would be angry and that it would flip. And I'm saying I don't know that. And you can correct me if I'm mistaking your point wrong. But I don't have that point of view that says it is so easy to predict that I know as a flat fact, or I have a very good idea of what is going to take place if they get rid of the filibuster. I don't know that at all. And I certainly don't know that if they get rid of the filibuster, things improve. The entire point of the filibuster that they've been using it for the past, God knows how long, 20 years, has been to basically gum up the works. What happens when the works aren't gummed up? I don't know. You may know. I don't. Those are your headlines, I suppose. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. if you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. You know, we've had this conversation about the death toll in the various countries. And, you know, I made this point about Brazil. And because Brazil has been getting hit with a huge number of people that have been dying as a result of COVID. And I have been due diligence trying to get somebody on the show to have a conversation about Brazil. This is Yahoo News. Brazil's brutal surge in COVID-19 deaths will soon surpass the worst of a record January wave in the United States, climbing well beyond an average of 3,000 fatalities per day, scientists predict, as contagious new variants overwhelm hospitals. Right here, Brazil's overall death toll trails only the U.S. outbreak with nearly 333,000 killed, according to Health Ministry data, compared with more than 555,000 dead in the United States. Now, it is believed that Brazil's death toll is actually going to be able to hit what we are in the United States. That's assuming that our death toll doesn't spike up. I mean, after all, 2,564 deaths is far higher than what was being reported for the last several days. In fact, that number, if I'm not mistaken, was in the hundreds yesterday and the day prior. That 2,000 number is astonishingly high. And this gets across the certain level of hysteria that we're seeing among health officials in the United States on this very specific case where Joe Biden is somewhat freaked out by that number. Keep in mind, Joe Biden's claim to fame on some level is that I'm the guy that is able to get this straight. I am the guy that was able to lower these numbers, and I'm the guy that's going to keep these numbers low. What happens if he's not? What happens if he's not that guy? What happens if those numbers start going up with Biden? What happens? And does he start getting blame for this level of COVID? I made the point before that Biden has somewhat of a problem here of politics. The moment that the number of people who start dying goes down, well, people like Fauci lose power. And it becomes somewhat of a political question of how do I open the economy? And that's where Biden basically is. How do I open the economy without that number going utterly and entirely bananas? And it seems that the number is going up. Now, from the standpoint of a country like Brazil, who may or may not hit this number, who does not have the financial resources of the United States, nor do they have the medical resources of the U.S. to be able to create these vaccines, they are at a far more significant disadvantage. And yet, we've told them to not use supplies of countries that we don't like. And it's not just Brazil. That's the wild part. If you think of the countries around the world, especially countries that consider themselves allies to the United States, well, what are we telling those countries? What are we whispering in their ear? What are we looking at when we're thinking of the Chinese vaccine or the Russian vaccines? Well, whereas many of the people in those countries just want the vaccine, you have other people in those countries that are higher up, that are well moneyed, that look at it as a geopolitical win. And that's a geopolitical win that we can't abide, even if it's heft against lives, even if it's heft against tens of thousands of lives. I keep bringing up the story because the story is mind-blowing to me, and it shocks the conscience in regards to a pandemic that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives. And the response to that pandemic is not the world holding hands, figuring out how could we beat it, but instead, this is the moment for geopolitical wrangling. This is the moment where we can figure out how do we get what we want politically. And if the other country is engaging in quote unquote vaccine diplomacy, basically giving their vaccine to whoever needs it, well, then that's a problem. Brazil was one of the countries that we pushed not to use the vaccine. And so when I'm making the point that Brazil's deaths are at 330,000 and they are projecting that number is going to skyrocket that much higher, that's appalling. We should not have had any point in pushing this country, or for that matter, Panama, to not use the supplies of countries that are beneficial to those countries that need it. This just so happened to be one of many. One of the other interesting stories that came out, and I'm just going to hit two for this particular break, it has to do with Mystery Wire. Now, Mystery Wire is George Knapp. George Knapp is the guy who basically put Area 51 on the map. Nobody really knew what that was until George Knapp brought out Bob Lazar and saying, basically that this place existed, that these guys were doing this testing and whatnot. And Lazar, to his credit, despite the fact of all of the things that have been said about him, and this isn't necessarily a rah-rah for Lazar. Lazar really doesn't have anything to do with it. This is more so to point out Knapp. Knapp is still doing what he has been doing all of these years. He is still questioning, he still has the sources, and he's still releasing information in drips. The latest information that he released has to do with a picture that initially it was unknown on whether or not the picture was accurate, but it's a pilot in an aircraft taking a picture of a craft in the distance. Now, initially it was thought that this was just one picture, but Knapp has been able to expose that there were multiple pictures and there were multiple objects in the sky at and around the same time where the pilot was able to get multiple shots of the same object. Now, Knapp has released 3 of these photos, and this has been getting a huge amount of consternation or a huge amount of conversation in the, let's say, this segment of the UFO community, especially with the report coming out in June. So the question, and there are many, if that thing was just staying in the air, why didn't anybody go to it? Meaning, this is where you get questions, right? This is where it's not just accepted when somebody puts something out. This is where people start asking questions about whether or not it's real. And I want to point out that that's positive. That's what you should have. Especially for a subject like this, there should be questions. There should be, hey, why? That doesn't make sense. Why is it, if it's standing there like that, then anybody just go to see it? Some of the items that they were putting forth was that the objects were just standing in the air. And the question is, if the object is just staying stationary in the air, why didn't you go to investigate? Oh, there are all sorts of questions. But basically, 3 items were found in the sky when the pilots were going through their particular maneuvers. And the thought, and if I'm not mistaken, Mellon made this point, that the reason why there's been so much consternation in the UFO circles recently has to do with the more prevalent frequency of these items and in the way that the pilots have been seeing them, especially in some of the flight paths that they have been taking. So this is good that there's questions about it. It is not good for the first story of pushing a country like Brazil that already has that number of deaths to avoid using a product that is in their best interest. Shane, I went with 2 stories this morning. Both were on my mind, so I just went with both. The first one, with the pushing of the meds. We've talked about that one before, and that was based on the Health and Human Services report for the 2021, I believe, 2020. The second one was a report that came out by George Knapp. This was recently. This was maybe a couple of days ago, where he basically takes a leaked photo and he gives out the rest of the photos that went along with that leaked photo. And initially, I wasn't sure whether the photo was legit. Well, you find out it was. And not just that, there are additional ones to go along with it. So people are asking a lot of questions on the second one. And in the first one, nobody's saying anything. How weird. What are your thoughts?
They're trippy looking photos. Those are, I'll put it like this. The photos are actually higher res than the Tic Tac video, the black and white grainy video that you've seen all over the place. George Knapp seems to be one of those more prominent dudes who covers this stuff. I haven't,
Donald Trump is on the line
more than I do, but I've run across him even then a number of times. When it comes to the first story that you brought
real quick.
Up, yes,
it seems that we have a caller. It's odd, but let's bring the caller in. This is very weird. We don't typically get callers. Hello, caller.
Hello, this is your once and future God King, Donald Trump speaking. I got an email from, what is this, Jamarl. What is this, some kind of African name?
Well, actually, it's Arabic. My mom just liked the name. Did you say?
Excuse me. My official title is once and future God King President Donald J. Trump.
Sir, I appreciate you calling in the show, but I don't believe for a moment that's an official title.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Who gave you that title?
Providence.
You're saying that Providence gave you the title of King God President.
Once and future God King President,
Right,
sir.
right. So exactly how did that work? How did Providence turn around and give you that name of God King? Because I don't believe for a moment that name is official.
Jamarl, Jammy Jam. I'm glad you asked. This is going to be huge breaking news. I don't think I've ever told anyone this before.
I'm doubtful, but go ahead.
It was days after the election. I sat behind the Resolute desk, drained, defeated by the globalists in a coup of epic proportions. I got word that the CIA had hired a China witch doctor from Cuba to reanimate the head of Hugo Chavez to get the secret codes to control the voting machines.
What? What?
Yes, it's true. It's huge. The CIA has stolen the head of every world leader for moments, just like the last election. The on-staff witch doctor caught COVID, and the backup didn't speak Spanish.
Mr. President, King God King.
Jamarl, that's when it happened. An angel of the Lord descended in a beam of light through the window and said, Donald J. Trump, from henceforth you will be the once and future God King President.
I'm skeptical of that.
I do believe you. You know what? I do believe him. We have the president on the line. We've got to go to our next guest. It's slightly more important, but I want to thank the once and past God King and former presidents of the United States, Donald Trump, for calling into the show. Truly unexpected. First in a lifetime, and possibly last. We've got to go to a break, though, folks. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. On the other side of this break, we will be speaking with Stephen Lenman. Great to have him. It's been a while. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines.
And
No question.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are joined for the first time in a while, and we're very glad to have him, by Stephen Lenman. He's an author and geopolitical analyst whose articles you can read at stephenlendman.org. Stephen, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Is it Shane?
It's great to have you. It's great to have you. It's been a while. It's really good to have you on the show again.
I must ask you, did Trump really call in?
It was an impersonator. I don't mean to give it away. And he was referring to himself as the once and future God King, who said that he was appointed by Providence as the once and future God King of the states. And he kept mispronouncing Jamarl's name in a kind of racist way. But some of the other stuff he was saying was pretty funny, in my opinion. But no, that was an impersonator, to be clear. Anyway, that was what just happened there. Anybody who's listening, that was not planned. Whoever called in was committed. They were devoted. I can respect that in my own way. Anyway, let's get into Ukraine and COVID. Again, people, if you want to check out Stephen Lenman's articles, you can go over to his website, stephenlenman.org. You'll see every day he has numerous articles coming out. He is a longtime and avid writer on politics, geopolitics, and various important world affairs. And specifically, let's start with Ukraine. We've been talking about this with guests. Let's start with the past couple of months. For over about a little bit over a month now, there have been worrying troop movements from within Ukraine, with Ukrainian troops heading from central and western Ukraine to the east side of the country, towards specifically the borders of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. At the same time, there has been intermittent artillery shelling for years now across the lines of these two smaller breakaway states and the Ukraine in general, the larger country Ukraine. That artillery shelling has increased. The rate of it has increased. And then over this past weekend, over about the past week, what a lot of people in the West would have heard about, more than what had been happening previously, certainly, is that Russia has been sort of shuffling, moving its troops around on the border there, moving some new troops into the region and largely moving troops that were already down there into other positions along the Ukrainian border. Now, the Western press is treating this as an incipient war, an incipient invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That is clearly, if you look at the history here, that's clearly not what's happening. They're sort of preparing their troops defensively, and even then the number of troops they have in the region are dwarfed by the size of the Ukrainian army as a whole. Not to say that things couldn't get worse, and this is where we turn to you, Stephen. How do you see all of this? Do you see this as, what do you think is going to come out of this? First of all, what am I missing there? What would you like to add in for background? And what do you see coming next, Stephen?
Well, I think what's going on is very, very dangerous. It all began in late 2013, culminating in mid-February 2014. The Obama-Biden staged a coup d'etat in Ukraine. The government wasn't particularly well run democratically, but it was a far cry from the regime the U.S. installed. A Nazi-infested regime. That's what's going on in Ukraine. First of all, under a guy named a billionaire chocolate king named Poroshenko. He was the first U.S. installed president, and now you get this guy Vladimir Zelensky, another U.S. Puppet, serving U.S. interests, and the target being Russia. Whether this will lead to a war with Russia, I don't know, but it certainly is pushing the envelope in that direction. Russia threatens nobody. The Russian Federation came into existence when the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991. Russia has never threatened or attacked another country, so we're talking about the last 30 years or so. Again, Russia wages peace, not war. And that's a good way of saying it, and certainly threatens nobody at all. Russia is independent of the U.S., and that's why the U.S. considers it an enemy of the imperial state, USA. But what's going on began in after the coup in 2014. There was a war number one. There have been intermittent shelling over the last 7 years by Ukrainian forces. This is all orchestrated by the U.S., the Pentagon, the CIA, other U.S. dark forces that are really running things, and regular shipments of U.S. weapons are pouring into Ukraine so they can continue the shelling of the Donbass area, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. People are being killed, people injured, mostly civilians. The Ukrainian military is staffed by the soldiers are conscripts who really have no interest in fighting anybody. They're not recruited. They're drafted into the Ukrainian military. I was a draftee back in the 1950s, but I didn't see any combat. That was a real quiet period when I was in the Army in the mid-1960s after college. But there was a draft back then. The draft no longer exists now. But these people don't want to fight. The people in Donetsk and Lugansk are very committed to defending their territory. They broke away from Kiev because they want democratic rule, and they reject Nazi-infested fascist rule, which is exactly what's going on in Kiev, the U.S.-installed government. Whether this thing is going to lead to a wider war, I don't know. It certainly did not while Trump was around. For all of his faults, he did not begin a new war. He continued the ones he inherited, but didn't begin a new one. But the Biden folks, these people are very belligerent. I call Secretary of State Blinken interventionist Blinken, which is what he's always been, and it's what he's doing now. now very hostile toward Iran while pretending otherwise, extremely hostile toward Russia, toward China, other countries independent of the U.S. But Ukraine right now is the world's top hotspot, and it literally could erupt into a full-scale war that possibly could spill across Russia's borders. Russian troops are mobilized along its borders, number one, because they annually they hold military exercises on their own territory. They don't cross into anybody else's territory, but they're also concerned about anything that might spill cross-border from Ukraine, and they want to protect Russian territory. They have no intention of invading Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, we would take same issue if there were hostile troops on the Mexican border trying to invade the U.S. or potentially with hostile intent towards the U.S. We wouldn't tolerate that at all. And I keep pointing out, we were willing to end the world for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in this case, you have NATO that is basically pushing troops up to the Russian border. And then the New York Post writing stories saying that Russia's about to start a war. Russia could trigger a European war. Isn't that phenomenal? They have troops in their own border. Right here. Now, Russia makes the point, though, that says on Friday, Russia warned that if it would take extra measures if NATO sends troops to the Ukraine. Well, yeah, because you're talking about basically sending hostile troops to their border from the various countries around the world. How have they been able to pull this propagandistic coup off, if that makes sense? Meaning, you have a situation where the United States says we're not going to expand to NATO, meaning if the Soviet Union ends, we are not going to take advantage of the Soviet Union. That's what we said. And of course, that ended up being farcical. We picked over the corpse and we expanded NATO to the borders of the country, which is basically a hostile military unit to the borders of a country. Russia has every right in the world to respond with, let's say, concern, to put it mildly, in the same way that any other European countries will respond if there was a hostile force at their border. Is that true, Stephen?
Oh, absolutely so. The number one task of any government in any country is to protect the security of the nation against hostile actors or actions, whatever. And certainly, I mean, if there's a war going on along Russia's borders, there was a full-scale war in 2014, 2015. There were Minsk agreements, Minsk I, Minsk II, and now the Zelensky regime has walked away from Minsk talks because it will not go to Minsk, Belarus, because it's a close ally of Russia. I mean, this is a lot of nonsense because Zelensky is simply repeating what his U.S. master is telling him to say. He's a puppet of the U.S. No matter what the government is in charge. Ukraine is a virtual U.S. colony, but the U.S. is running things there. But absolutely, Russia has an obligation to protect its people, to protect its territory. That's what it's doing. It has no aggressive designs in any other country, and judge Russia by its actions. Forget all the rhetoric and everything else. Judge Russia by its actions. For 30 years, it never attacked another nation, never threatened to attack another nation, but it certainly will protect its territory, and if attacked, it can certainly hit back hard. Russia's super weapons exceed the best in the West. Developed at a small fraction of the cost, by the way.
And thankfully, I mean, we've been covering this. I doubt that the war in Ukraine will immediately lead to that. It seems like this is a game of brinksmanship that the United States specifically is trying to use, largely for PR purposes. I've heard very plausible arguments that they've already gotten a sort of optical success back home, even just with this first spate of articles coming out. Now, on the other hand, those are just articles, and I think the recipients of the Western press, the audience, is kind of already by and large bought into the narrative that Russia is a boogeyman, that, a lot of people, even though they get the sense that, they don't trust the media, they don't trust what they hear a lot of the time, there has been a successful deep propaganda campaign to try to extend the Cold War and extend the vilification of that country. And I think a lot of people have bought into it, I'm sad to say. So having said that there was some initial PR success on this one, with Russia moving their troops into the border and around the border, and that being painted as an imminent Russian invasion, even though that's bogus, that news has gotten out. It's now a sort of piece of the narrative that the United States is trying to construct about this event. And I guess here's what I'm wondering: if it doesn't lead to war, if it's just building more tension and trying to, throw a thicker wedge between Ukraine and between Russia, what would it be leading towards? Just put war out of the equation for a second. What do you see coming next in the next year, next couple of years, and even the next couple of months, Stephen?
Well, what's going on is what I call the U.S. waging war by other means on targeted nations, on Russia, on China, on Iran, on Venezuela, North Korea, you name them, countries that are independent of U.S. control. That's the only common denominator of all these nations. They don't threaten anybody. They're not at war with anybody. They're not hostile to anybody. They prefer having cooperative relations with all other countries. North Korea, maybe the number one boogeyman going back to the 1940s, along with Russia, Soviet Russia, of course. North Korea never threatened or attacked another country, including in June 1950, when the U.S. attacked North Korea, not the other way around. North Korea didn't attack the South attacked the North, and the U.S. got involved. So we're brainwashed to believe what establishment media tell us, and they're simply operating as agents of the U.S. imperial state and U.S. moneyed interests and so on. There's no way anybody can know anything by following establishment media. They need to follow Sputnik News. They need to follow other independent media to have any idea what's going on, because establishment media, whether it's CNN, the New York Times, you name them, they all lie. They all deceive. They all engage in mass deception. There's no end of it. And I spent a lot of time criticizing them.
We're out of time, and I want to thank you again for joining us. I know you have to go, but it's been a while, and it's great to hear from you.
Thank you, Jane. We never did get to COVID, which is another big issue for me. Maybe we could do that another time.
It would be great to. We got to close this one out for now, though, folks. That was the voice of Stephen Lendman. He's an author and geopolitical analyst whose articles you can read over at his website. That's stephenlendman.org. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We need to go into a break, but we'll be back on the other side in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. I'm going to give a shout out to Stephen Lendman. He came on at short notice, and he is always awesome. The man is very brilliant on the issues of foreign policy. Look, having the conversation about the Ukraine and Russia is somewhat of a big deal, just because of the implications of what could take place. If you think back over the last several years, what was one of the main things they hit Donald Trump on? Yes, it was Trump and Russia, and yes, everything Donald Trump did was put through this lens of being beneficial to Vladimir Putin, regardless of the fact that Donald Trump was attacking countries that Russia was aligned with, or getting rid of treaties that Russia and the United States have been put into place for like decades, or even sanctions. Like Donald Trump not putting through sanctions immediately was looked at as Donald Trump helping Putin, as opposed to, if Donald Trump pushed through these sanctions, Donald Trump is basically saying that he himself was elected with the help of a foreign power, something that he wasn't going to do. And even the missile stuff, Obama wouldn't send weapons to the Ukraine in that way, offensive weapons to the Ukraine, because he understood that, hey, that looks bad, and any person that is killed by one of those weapons is basically being killed by a weapon that was sent by the United States. That's a little dicey. I don't want to touch that. But what did they do? They attacked Trump on that very same point. This is not a rah-rah for Trump. This is more so a rah-rah for reality, and pointing out the differences and the distinctions in the way that Trump was treated versus the way Obama was treated. And now we're at this situation where Biden is back in office. You have howler monkey Democrats who believe any and everything that happened from the standpoint of Trump winning the race was entirely directly and related to Russia in some way, even despite the fact that Roger Stone was prosecuted. Because Roger Stone's prosecution means that there was no there. There was no link. But people like Schiff would use the fact that Stone was prosecuted, again, evidence that there was no link, is somehow evidence of a link because Stone was connected with Trump. It's very bizarre, and it is basically what has been taking place. And so now you have the situation with Ukraine, with Joe Biden in office, and you have what seems to be provocations. And the troop movements in the context of Russia and their own borders is now all of a sudden being called a pretext for war. It has nothing to do with the Nazis, or has nothing to do with these guys provocating at the border. It's unclear, at least to me, what happens here. And it is worrying and disconcerting, however, that this is taking place. So we're going to open this up to callers. The call line is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Shane, what are your thoughts? I mean, let me know this right. We were involved in instigating a coup. And he just passed recently. I can't think of his name, Cohen. But Cohen and Aramite has really good drill down into how this works and the mechanics of this. Meaning putting through the provision for the UN from NATO and having these guys being in alignment with NATO and the European Union, and how that became untenable for the presidency. All of this stuff, he goes into a deep dive. Yeah, he does a deep dive into all of it. So, look, I would suggest that people, if they really want to get into the mechanics of it, check that interview out with Cohen. But what are your thoughts on this stuff, Shane? I mean, I am very concerned because even though I don't necessarily think Biden wants a war, and even though I don't necessarily think that many of the elements of Europe want a war, I do think that there's a level of brinksmanship associated with people thinking that they are the world leaders and that they should have the right to dictate world affairs. And honestly, it really does seem like the issue that the U.S. has is that Russia is not within a sphere of influence, and that it has yanked itself out of the Yeltsin years of being basically, at the whims of the other nations. Or for that matter, China doesn't seem to be at the Western whims. A lot of this seems to be posturing and a certain degree of consternation that we don't have control and influence over those spheres of control. And we have a great issue with it. Same thing with Syria, same thing with North Korea, same thing with Iran. It's not like these countries are belligerently attacking everybody. That's not it. We're the ones that are belligerently attacking everybody while simultaneously screaming that we're the weakest party in the world and we're being attacked by everybody. Weirdest thing in the world. But what are your thoughts?
I think that this is a particular issue for Biden. I think that Biden has a long-term animosity towards Russia. And whether you look at Ukraine, where, again, under the Obama administration, he was the viceroy for the country, as the U.S. did its coup over there, and as we oversaw the transition process. Of course, like I believe Lee mentioned the other day, he also brought Victoria Nuland in. Victoria Nuland was sort of our point person when it came to handling Ukrainian affairs, to the point where we should really play this sometime. She was even caught in a call. Again, for folks who've been listening for a long time, you already know this, but I'll reiterate. She was even caught in a call basically choosing the next president, choosing the leadership of the incoming administration. Now, that call blew up because she said F the EU during it, which was seen, of course, as a diplomatic slight and a sign of animosity from her. But the real important thing there is that she and Jeffrey Piot, another administration official, are talking, okay, who should be the next president? Who should be in what position in the incoming Ukrainian administration? Whether you look at Biden's relationship there and the fact that he chose to bring her in at a higher level in his current admin, or whether you choose to look at back in 2005 in the relationship with Russia specifically, how Biden was the senator to introduce Senate Resolution 322, again, a thing my dad brings up kind of frequently here, basically on Mikhail Khodorkovsky, an oligarch in Russia who Vladimir Putin went after he did bad stuff, frankly, and then effectively fled to the West and has now become one of the main figures that the media and politicians go to when they're referring to how evil they think Putin is for cracking down on this guy. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky, we should probably do a dedicated segment or two on him at some point, just because in terms of what happened in the wake of the 90s, he is an important figure to understand in terms of Russia's sort of domestic politics and, Putin's relationship with the business elites in that country and the kinds of thing that he did to get them to calm down a bit after this era of privatization, this sort of new Wild West had happened. And a lot of people got rich on ill-gotten gains way too quickly. Anyway, Biden was the one to introduce the Senate resolution protecting Khodorkovsky. So with just sort of those two data points, it makes sense that he would carry those policies forward. We've got a bunch of calls and only time for hopefully all of them, but let's get into them. We've got Tarif from New Orleans calling in first. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
All right, I had two comments, but I'm just going to deal with one. The Pope had made a video 2 days ago. It seems, he was talking about we got to end this poverty and this social injustice against humanity. We got to make jobs for people, pull, people from out of poverty. Then he also went on to say that you have people that fight for humanity that try to expose the wrongdoings in society, and what happens, they get slandered or thrown in jail in regimes or dictatorships or democracy in crisis. So when he went to that, when he included that in his 2-minute speech, I think he was referring to, in my opinion, to journalists in general, Julian Assange and other whistleblowers, which was, I think, is a good thing, because I know Julian Assange's wife, Stella Morris, and I and other people was trying to get in contact with the Pope to try to get him to pray about Julian Assange and whistleblowers and journalists. It seemed like he, in a way, kind of came through. But it's under 2 minutes long. Y'all gotta go and watch it. You gotta go to the Pontiff, his Twitter site, and you'll see him speak. It's very straight to the point about poverty, and people being considered second-class citizens and not having jobs and healthcare and social, and people that's actually standing up for those people that get slandered and thrown in prison without no fair trials or whatever. So I think he was referring to Julian Assange and other people in dealing with poverty in general, and of course, free Julian Assange.
Tarif agreed on that. I mean, and what would make you think this? I'm not sure that he was referring to Julian Assange specifically, but what might lead you to believe that again is that the Pope had a letter sent to Julian Assange while he was in prison. This was reported in Italian media, and then Stella Morris, again, Julian Assange's romantic partner, retweeted this out and kind of brought it to American publicity, into the American sphere. Anyway, we got more calls. Tarif, thank you for the call. We have Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, quickly, just on what Tarif said. The Pope basically comes from the Enlightenment school of preaching within the Catholic Church, as opposed to sort of the Calcanian sort of teachings of the Catholic Church. So probably explains the difference there. But on what's going on around the world, basically you had two schools of thought after the fall of the Soviet Union. You had Francis Fukuyama with the end of history thesis, and you had Samuel Huntington with the Kosher Civilizations. And basically Huntington was a realist, whereas Fukuyama was one of the liberal sort of neocons who believed that democracy had won the day and there'd never be a war again. And I think, if you look at realism and the Kosher Civilization is what's happening. You've got the Russian civilization, the Chinese, Asian civilization uniting around China. You've got like the Turkish civilization, you've got the Iranian civilization, and you've still got you've got some allies. There's allies in the Middle East, in South America. The socialist sort of socialist leftist civilization in South America, all sort of uniting. And like the old saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Is America's making that a reality, and basically they're even pushing Turkey and Iran into the same orbit, and they're pushing China and Turkey and Russia into the same orbit. And, Turkey is the second biggest army in NATO. You take Turkey out of NATO, you haven't even got a NATO in Europe. All you got is America.
Michael, we got one more caller, and I don't even know if we have time for it, but I want to be quick here. A brief response there. I mean, in my opinion, and we can come back to this later, if you combine both of their theses, you get the idea of the end of civilizations. I would say that we have more or less one global civilization. Whether you're looking at China or Russia or Iran or the United States, the extent to which their political and economic institutions overlap, the extent to which they have imitated each other over decades at this point, it leads me to believe that you effectively have one. But the way you painted that is right. There was the contest between Fukuyama and Huntington. We've got about 20 seconds here, Louise. If you want to, you can call back, or we can bring you on now. We've got Louise calling in from Virginia. What's on your mind?
No, everybody else is much more interesting than I am. This is terribly dangerous, and I hope you keep covering it. And I hope people realize, if your phone lines aren't jammed for this subject, then something has to be improved, because this is terrible. Terrible.
Louise, it is terrible, and you're too humble. You're a great caller. You're always to the point and honest, and I really appreciate it. We got to close this out though, folks. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That will strongly insist that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. It's funny, I don't know if Fukuyama has ever been mentioned on mainstream media. I love it. I love it.
No, I don't know. On Fukuyama, I mean, okay, so here's the thing. I disagree with the whole end of history thesis,
I don't buy the
book
end of
recommendation.
History thesis,
His book, The Origins of Political Order, is actually pretty solid. I would recommend that. And
I'm just making the point that it's mentioned.
Oh, I hear you.
That the audience even knows who he is. Oh, I love that. God, you have no idea how much I love that.
Yeah, Michael's a good caller. No, he brings it to that high level often when he calls in.
All right, so let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 2,564 new coronavirus deaths and 73,200 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 65,556 cases per day, an increase of 14% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,944,100 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and over 558,000 have been killed by it. I don't think it's the virus that killed them. I think it's malfeasance by the United States government in the way that it handled it. But fair enough. I don't want to quibble over the minute details. Yesterday, European leaders failed to come to an agreement over how AstraZeneca vaccine should be distributed among the bloc's member countries. This comes after European Medics Agency has come out saying the blood clot should be listed as a, quote, very rare, unquote, side effect of the vaccine, with approximately 1 in 250,000 suffering the symptoms, according to head of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the United Kingdom. Germany has limited the use of AstraZeneca vaccine to people over the age of 60 and to high priority groups. France and Belgium only administer the vaccine to people age 55 and over. In Finland, it is given only to people age 65 and older. Other European countries have not yet placed age limits on the vaccine. Very interesting. And we were getting into the conversation yesterday about whether or not this was being done for political reasons or whether or not it's being done because there is a real legitimate medical potentiality to the blood clots. And that if you don't know who you are, whether or not there's a due diligence on the medical agency to kind of point that out, knowing the larger repercussions. Now, I would say that from a medical standpoint, it is your job if you just point out that, hey, this has a potential side effect to whatever the percentage of people. Now, I guess the point, though, is that the moment that you say that, people are not going to want to take the vaccine, or they're going to be very leery of the vaccine. And AstraZeneca's problem is kind of the Comey problem. Now, what do I mean by the Comey problem, or the Comey paradox? The Comey paradox is that if you are one Hillary Clinton or somebody like Hillary Clinton, and you're running in a presidential election, and somebody comes out and says you're being investigated, okay, fair enough. If the person comes out and says you're cleared, people like me are going to say, oh, aggravated. And more, not just people like me are going to hear what Comey said, sounds like she's guilty, and yet she's going to get a pass. But the problem is, if you come back later and say, well, wait a minute, there's a little bit more evidence that says she may be guilty. Okay, she's good. You've introduced another level of questions into the conversation and dialogue that is going to be pressing and is going to be difficult to get rid of. What about AstraZeneca? AstraZeneca comes out. You don't have other drugs. Pfizer, nobody says anything about blood clots for Pfizer. Nobody says blood clots about the Sputnik vaccine or the Chinese vaccines. They have several. No, it's AstraZeneca. And the moment that you say that, and then you come back later and say, okay, well, wait a minute, this requires new research. And more importantly, we're not even going to give it to the people that are below a certain age. What are the people in your countries going to think? And are they going to be less likely to take that vaccine? And the answer is yes. And you can see the distribution rates of the vaccine in the various countries to get across that what I'm saying here is right. What do you think about it, Shay? And I think the moment that you come out with something like that, you damage the image of that vaccine in a way that is pressing and a way that is difficult to get rid of. It's stick-to-itive in its nature. What are your thoughts? So listen.
I was looking at a breakdown of okay, so for a given medication for something given for treatment medically, if you have a side effect that can come in, if there's a certain incidence of it, if it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens some of the time, there was a breakdown of like, how do you have to specify it? So I think it was something like 1 in 10. You have to call it very common, 1 in 100, something like less common. Then it goes down to rare and very rare. And I believe that the very rare category started at 1 in 10,000. So if 1 in 10,000 people who take X get it, if you have a 100th of a 100th of a chance of getting it, then that qualifies as a very rare side effect. Now, this is like 25 times less likely than that threshold, which means you could vaccinate entire populations of people, saving who knows how many tens of thousands of lives in the process with this drug, which seems like one of the weaker vaccine candidates. And you would still have a small fraction of the people, a much smaller fraction of the people dying from the vaccine than you do from the virus. And for a vaccine-strapped region like the European Union to not go forward with it, to not do everything they can to try to fix the situation, to try to fix the optical problem, I think they're making a huge mistake. And again, looking at history in a sort of sliding doors sense, what would happen if they'd handled this better? I think they would have saved a lot more lives. And I think I hear, we had a private conversation, so I know kind of where you're coming from on this one. There is a big optical hit here when you associate something like this with an illness, but every medication that you take, by and large, is going to have some, side effects, some symptomatology, something that comes along with it on the side that you don't like. And this is an extremely, extremely rare side effect. So if this is what drags it down, if this is the anchor around it, just think about how many lives are going to get lost because of that. And again, if they had ready access to a better vaccine, if they had the Pfizer vaccine all up the wazoo and they were able to administer it immediately to large numbers of the population, then my argument wouldn't apply. But they don't. They're strapped for them. And so I think whatever they can do to salvage it, they should.
Yeah, we were comparing this to the marijuana stuff in D.C., where I don't care if people know. I was telling here in Baltimore, it's legal. I mean, you can have your card and everything else. You can go and buy whatever you want to buy from the standpoint of pot. And, you get to a point after a while where you're like, you know what? I don't like the container that pot comes in. I'm going to get this other stylish container, and I'm going to buy it out of that same product, but I don't like the container. And my wife was kind of making the point, it was like, you've gotten to the point where you're that bougie, where the container is the thing? It feels like that. It feels like the Europe has gotten to the point of saying, I don't like that vaccine. I want to go with this other vaccine that has the better packaging of the vaccine. And it's like, dude, you don't have that option. Like, you don't have that level of decision and choice where you can go for the better packaging. You are in a situation where you are dying and the numbers are going up. And instead of kind of dealing with it, yeah, I agree with you, Shane. I guess my only point is from an optical standpoint, it looks bad. But from a legitimate reality standpoint, well, what is the efficacy of other vaccines? And what is the chances of other vaccines having some kind of deleterious side effect? And does it compare? And so I totally get your point. But do you think
another way to look
politics?
at this?
That's the question. Do you think they were doing this in order to hit back at the UK or something like that because of what these guys were doing? That's the ultimate question.
Yeah, I think that's what pushed the boulder down the hill, and then it acquired its own weight. But yeah, I think that the wedge between Britain and the EU over Brexit, and the fact that Britain has a paternalistic sense of ownership over the vaccine, because of course they think of it as the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. They think of it as, developed, inspired by Oxford University, which is like the premier British academic institution. They feel like it's theirs on a deep sense. We've talked about this with Peter Oliver before, and they were, regardless, had a bunch of supplies of it. They've been using it to good effect. They're one of the top leading countries in terms, particularly of a country of their size. I think for a country of their size, over 100 million people there, they're at the top of the stack right now in terms of vaccine distribution around the world. So they were using a bunch of it. The EU didn't have as much access to it. EU leaders, in a confusing set of circumstances, started to push back on them, and simultaneously on it, they were looking for other vaccines they could get into wider development. And yeah, I don't think that it's all. I'm not saying that these stories are created by politicians or that this is all a false flag to try to gin up fear about. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I think that's what got the ball rolling, and it would have been far wiser. And I think of the EU as technocrats. I would think the technocrats would take the opposite side of this. I would think they would look at the number of lives they could potentially save, and they would be like, okay, the public has these unjustified concerns about this drug. Let's try to calm this down because it is in their best interest, in the sort of nanny state sense, for them to do that. But they didn't, and it's weird to me. They got co-opted by politics too. I'll end like this. I am glad that in the U.S. I got the Pfizer vaccine. I got, by what all appearances, better than the Johnson & Johnson, better than the Moderna vaccine. So I do prioritize vaccines. I would have taken the Sputnik V vaccine ahead of Pfizer, but hey, don't exactly have access to it here. But that's where I go. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to do that or that it's completely irrational to prefer one to the other, but it's what they have.
Right. The issue is luxury of choices. That's the point. Like, they don't have a luxury of choices in this case. It's like AstraZeneca is the one that they have. Germany apparently is working or is in conversations about the Sputnik vaccine. I mean, that's another one where apparently, I don't know if it was on the table for them to try to get access to, and they may not necessarily want it to. But that's another thing, foreign policy reasons for not necessarily going for that. Like, so I feel your point on this. I don't know. It's just very cynical to go with the idea that it was politics. But I know what you're saying. You're not putting this is their only reason and justification for it. That's not where you're going with that. You're making a point of saying there is an incentive for them to kind of behave in that way. And it's this kind of pushback to the UK that might have taken a life of its own. I also agree with you that the European Union are technocrats. But they're also just human beings. And as human beings, they can kind of feel some kind of way with the stuff that goes on. So, I don't know. I don't think they have a luxury of options. And I think if the Sputnik V vaccine was available, if the Chinese vaccine was available, the moment that you nail down their efficacy and the fact that they work, then they're all just medicine. Take it. Come on. Argentina will implement an overnight curfew until the end of the month, starting this Friday, as the country seeks a spike in COVID cases, with a record of 22,039 new cases reported in the previous day, up from a record of 20,870 the day before. The message was delivered by Argentinian President Alberto Fernandez from his private residence, where he is self-isolating after having contracted the virus. Some 4.5 million Argentinians have received at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine so far. Look, speaking about that for the moment, I made the point that I wouldn't take the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so I can't necessarily take issue with people having feelings about it. Now, my reasoning has to do with other issues of blood clots. And if there's even a chance that that vaccine has something to do with it, I don't want to take the chance. And the moment that I see myself as taking that tact, how can I take an issue with other people taking that tact? I kind of see where they're coming from, even though in realism or realistically, the chances of it happening are like 0.000 something percent. It's just kind of the thing that gets in your head the moment that somebody says something about it. Disney World in Orlando is lightening its requirements on mask use slightly by allowing visitors to the theme park to remove their mask when taking pictures outdoors, including with characters. Isn't that nice? Poland has logged over 950 deaths, the highest single death toll in the country yet. And this is again from COVID. And this will be the last one. The chief prosecution investigator at the Derek Chauvin trial has reversed part of his evidence. In a film from the death of George Floyd, the prosecutor had originally referenced Floyd as saying, quote, "I ate too many drugs," unquote, but has since reversed the statement or revised the statement as Floyd saying, "I ain't done no drugs," quote, unquote. The defense is arguing that the main cause of Floyd's death was drug use, with the prosecution arguing that the cause of death was Chauvin's knee rammed into into George Floyd's throat for over 9 minutes. That is kind of what I see it as also. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at Shane in the background complaining that the people aren't, that the chances of death for the AstraZeneca vaccine are so astronomically large.
I'll put it like this: the average American is 50 times more likely to die from a car crash in a single year of driving than they would be to die from blood clots from getting this vaccine. It's true, man.
Yeah, he was pretty hot about this yesterday. You guys don't know. He was raging out about this. I was like, whoa, he's gonna hurt himself. No, you're right, man. You're right. You're totally right. They put a knife in this
almost
vaccine.
got blood clots just thinking about it.
Right, just thinking about them arguing with the blood clots. All right, let's get into the show. I want to talk about the fall or the crack in the blue wall. And what's been interesting at the Derek Chauvin trial, I think we're in day 8 or day 9, is that the people who are coming on to testify are cops themselves. Now, I watch Tamir Rice get executed by a cop within a few seconds. And even then, you had the situation where they were backing the cop that did it. But in this case, this is very weird and very disorienting slightly to see policemen get on stand and say, Chauvin had no right to do what he did. Chauvin should have stopped at the point where he was complicit or compliant. And these guys are basically, one after the next, putting a knife in Derek Chauvin, former cop Derek Chauvin. I want to have a conversation about the crumbling of the blue wall, or the crack in the blue wall. And more interestingly, whether or not this is not a crack in the blue wall at all. This is a, let's say, an establishment or a solidifying of the blue wall by cutting bait on Chauvin, as if what Chauvin did was something separate and distinct from the way other cops behave in a normal day at the office. To engage this conversation, we're joined with Garland Nixon. He's a close friend of the show. He's a Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. And of course, he is our resident expert on all things dealing with the police force. Garland, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, gentlemen. Great to be back.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, man. I really do appreciate it. So I want to play this clip. And this is a clip of Minneapolis Police Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman. And listen to what he says on the stand. We're only going to play maybe a minute of this. Let's play the clip.
Have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
If you, as an officer, according to the training, you handcuff somebody behind the back, what's your responsibility with regard to that person from that moment on?
That person is yours. He's your responsibility. His safety is your responsibility. His well-being is your responsibility.
Once you handcuff somebody, does that affect the amount of force that you should consider using?
Absolutely.
How so?
Once a person is cuffed, the threat level goes down all the way, to they're cuffed. How can they really hurt you?
Let's stop right there for a moment. Let's stop right there. That is the operative point, right? The moment that the person is down, the moment that the person is cuffed, the moment that the person is no longer a threat to you, you stop. Your job as a cop is not to execute. It's not maximum force. It's not to punish or to be punitive. It is to get that person and process that person safely. That person has a right to life every bit as much as the cop has a right to life, and every bit as much as everybody else. Garland, am I wrong in making that assessment? That the job of the cop is not to kill or to beat or to injure. Those are things that happen if necessary. The job is to get that person and process that person safely as possible, period. And it didn't seem like that was the thing that was done here. Hence, many of the cops that are coming forward saying, yes, that is indefensible. What are your thoughts? I would imagine you've watched this trial so far, not just of that clip, but what are your thoughts of the trial up to this point?
Well, I think, the interesting thing about this trial is that so many things that we look at are blatantly obvious, and I find it disheartening in some ways that people are excited over, I'll put it like this. Chris Rock did a comedy routine a while back where he said, people shouldn't get accolades for doing some things that they ought to do. If he said, some guy said, I pay for my kids. And he's like, you should pay for your kids. So you shouldn't, that isn't something you brag about. So to me, when I watch this, I think it's a sad statement of America when we see just things that should be routine such as this. People just make glaringly obvious statements that you don't even have to be, I was a trained law enforcement, sure, but you don't have to be a trained law enforcement officer to look at this, to recognize that if a person is handcuffed, that no greater use of force is necessary. You don't have to be trained to realize that basically, if I shoot someone in the heart, I can't argue that they died of blood loss. And therefore, I didn't contribute to their death. We can just say that person bled to death. So I choked somebody until they stopped breathing. But there was, but maybe they were on drugs. They were in a bad mood. They were hyped up. So I think, to me, when I watch it, I don't feel as though something good is happening. I feel disheartened that things that should be in a society where everyone's treated equal and where all things come out as they should, that we have to kind of clap and say, hooray, finally we're getting normalcy. To me, it's not normalcy. It's the opposite of normalcy.
Well, but what also seems to be normal is police banding together to protect each other. And this comes as in just the past couple of days. On Tuesday, New York City ended qualified immunity for police officers. And then yesterday, the state of New Mexico did the same. It seems like there are some wider changes, although, again, they're limited to individual states. But there are some changes being implemented in a few cases on police policy. And I'm guessing that those are going to be driven by last summer's protests and by, raising public awareness about these issues. How do you think that's going to affect police in the future? I mean, if this is a blue wall crumbling, if the aegis that Chauvin specifically as a former police officer was under, if that's being lifted, is that going to become a trend here? What do you think about the probability there? Do you think this kind of thing, do you think police basically can expect impunity from other police if they commit moral and legal trespasses in the future based on what's going on, or is that just going to continue? What's your take as a former member of the Forest Garland?
Well, let's not forget at the same time that there are these types of bills going on. There's a bill in Kentucky, Senate Bill 211, which would make it illegal to insult the police. Just insult the police. I got some serious First Amendment issues there, right? So, I mean, I think there's some serious First Amendment issues there. So I see a cultural battle in America going on. So I don't see it as going, one way that we're going, that there's laws that are passed that are going to make things better and more equitable. So, no, I don't. I just feel as though this is a single instance of law enforcement officers doing exactly what they should do in a normal society, and that it doesn't indicate any changes whatsoever to me. The other thing is, look at the dynamics here. We're looking at a police department. The spotlight was put on them worldwide. Everybody watched the video. So they had one of their police stations burned down. They had violence and there's an uprising in their city. So as law enforcement officers, even right now, they have to be concerned that, just out of survival, that if this trial doesn't go, if there's no conviction or, if in fact, there's an acquittal, that they could be personally facing danger themselves. So there's some level of, self-serving consideration going on here. So personally, one instance, that doesn't do anything for me, particularly in an instance where the officers, they've got a dog in the hunt. The bottom line is they got to go back to these streets. So the question is, do they want to go back to these streets in danger, or do they want to hopefully go back to these streets in a way that they don't feel danger?
And there's a larger point here also, this solidification of the blue wall. Like, I know some people in the press are arguing that this is like breaking of the blue wall or cracking the blue wall. I think I might even put it into the header. But I can make a case that said this is solidification of that wall. That basically it's cops saying, look, when it really comes down to it, we all agree that that's behavior is not becoming of a police officer. Where the wild part is, if you talk to Chauvin 3 a.m. between him and his guide, he probably thought I was doing my job. And the other cops will say, there, but for the grace of God go I. Because I would imagine they acted just like Chauvin. Like many of the cops, if you caught them on any random day, would have probably been caught kneeling on somebody's throat, just as a typical day at the office. And so all of these guys now saying, yep, I would have never done that. That's not the job. That's not how it's supposed to be done. On some level comes across to me as, all right, we're going to cut bait in order to solidify our current station. That's what it feels like. Am I wrong on that? Because it's not the entirety of policing that's on trial. It's Derek Chauvin. And maybe policing should be on trial with Chauvin. Whereas what Chauvin is doing is not abnormal or not unusual, not this kind of bizarre thing that the guy just so happened was doing. Chauvin looked as placid and as calm as ever.
Yeah, you make a good point, and that makes me think about this when you bring up Derek Chauvin. One of the things that institutions do when there is an institutional problem, the institution will make the bad apple argument, right? This is not an institutional problem. There's one individual. And if we could just get this individual dealt with and move him out, because the institution is fine, the institution is clean, the institution needs no change. So there are times when an institution will sacrifice an individual member of the institution for the good of the entire institution. Exactly. Now, a police department, Derek Chauvin does something and people look at it and they're like, wow, that kind of looks familiar. That's not good. Is there a problem with the institution? And the institution responds is by saying, no. There's just this one bad guy. And you know what? We agree with you. He is a bad guy. Why? What is he doing in a pristine, clear, and clean institution like this? We will reject this bad individual, set him aside. We will help you beat him, and we will. And in this instance, from what I've seen, Chauvin is in fact does appear to me to have violated the law based on my research. And in my opinion, if I were on the jury based on what I've seen, I would probably vote to convict. But my point, not probably, I would, based on everything I've seen, I would vote to convict. But my point is, you've always got to be wary of institutions because they are very good at protecting the institution, and they think nothing about throwing an individual to the dogs for the good of to save the institution and to continue with the argument and the premise and the narrative that the institution is clean, and to prove, look, it even proves how clean we are. In fact, when we had a bad apple, we threw the bad apple out, and then afterwards they go back to what they were doing.
God, let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I think we're bringing you back, Garland. So let's do this.
We got Ted on now.
Okay. So I'm going to thank you for coming on, Garland. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice that you guys are listening to is Garland Nixon. He's Sputnik political analyst and co-author or co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. You can follow Garland's work on as host of the Critical Hour, Monday through Friday, from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik, on Twitter at Garland Nixon, and Garland Nixon on Facebook and YouTube. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Matt Gaetz, Florida representative, longtime staunch supporter of Donald Trump's, now under federal investigation for alleged sex trafficking, specifically for allegedly having sex with a 17-year-old girl as an adult. Gaetz is 38, engaged last year. The announcement of that initial investigation, which Gaetz said was spurred by an extortion campaign launched by a former DOJ employee, has now expanded, and reportedly investigators are looking into Gaetz's traveling to the Bahamas with women, allegations that he paid them for sex. His campaign, or his office and he specifically, have both shut this down, basically saying he's never paid for sex in his life. As an adult man, he has never slept with a 17-year-old girl. And he and many of his supporters, I'm sure, are painting this as an attack on him for his politics. Meanwhile, however, the investigation is ongoing. To talk about this, whether there's a there to it, we are joined by Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you can follow on Twitter at Ted Rall and on his website. You can read his cartoons and articles. That's rall.com, RALL.com. Ted, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. I'm probably having a better day than Matt Gaetz. How are you?
Undoubtedly you are, and probably a much better day than his fiancee too, who has been radio silent as you would expect given everything that's going on. Let's start with this. I mean, I know that you've been following this. This has been a big topic recently. One other side of it that I left out. Also, word is out that he had sought a blanket preemptive pardon for a group of politicians, himself potentially and very likely included, from Donald Trump before Donald Trump left office. Donald Trump has said that he never personally was petitioned by Gaetz on this, but nevertheless, that story is out there. Anyway, Ted, what do you make of all of this? I know that, we're sort of watching this from the spectators' seats. We don't know what the heck is going on. We don't know a lot of the truth here, but how does it come across to you?
Well, it's got shades of Larry Craig and Anthony Weiner. The serial aspect is what really stands out here. Normally, when there's a Capitol Hill sex scandal, there's a few incidents, maybe one, maybe 4, 3, but this has obviously been a pattern of behavior, or alleged behavior, with Representative Gaetz. And, it's interesting that he has been able to hang on so long. He's kind of following the sort of Governor Cuomo approach to just hoping that it blows over. If you resign too quickly, then where are you? And I think that's probably smart. The most leverage he probably has against a potential prosecution is the ability to say, okay, I will resign in exchange for the dropping of these charges or for some sort of blanket immunity. He's clearly in massive legal jeopardy. He knows it. He obviously is represented by competent counsel, and it's a very, frankly, a sick statement on the state of certain members of the House of Representatives that so many people in the Republican caucus apparently knew about this and sort of didn't have anything to say. But that's sort of a standard problem with these sort of things. People, the tacit consent is kind of often the more disturbing aspect of these scandals.
What's wild about this too that's coming out has to do with the reputation that Gaetz has. Because these things are dovetailing in somewhat of a weird way. Meaning there's one part where there's an investigation. So the investigation includes an examination of payments to women. Investigators believe that he paid for sex with a number of women he met through Joel Greenberg, a former Florida tax collector who has been indicted last year on federal sex trafficking charge, among other offenses. People close to the investigation told the New York Times. Now, Gaetz is saying, that's not true, that's not true. And right here, the inquiry focuses on Representative's relationship with women recruited for online sex and whether he had sex with a 17-year-old girl. Yeah, Gaetz is in a bit of trouble. And then you have this other stuff that comes out about the person that doesn't help in the least, that he was showing off, or that he has this kind of reputation of a horn dog, and that he was showing off pictures of women that he had sex with in Congress. And I remember one in particular of this unfortunate woman with a hula hoop, naked woman with a hula hoop. And Gaetz basically said, hey, I hit that. I had sex with that. That was his rep. Now, the question, obviously, that CNN and some of these other people are going to bring up implicitly, whether they ask it explicit or not, are some of the women that Gaetz was showing, even on the congressional floor, women that he might have paid for. And therein, on some level, lies the problem with Gaetz exposing and showing this stuff around where people can point out and says, yes, he was a horn dog. Yes, he showed us about the women that he was having sex with all the time. Yes, he used to brag about these women. And then, well, wait a minute. Were any of the women that he bragged with or bragged about either underage or B, paid for in this salacious way? This looks bad. Gaetz has gone mum about this, obviously. What do you think, for the standpoint of the other people that are around him? Like you said, the silence is the issue. Is it that, and we're all men here, that we have conversations about these type of items and we don't see these conversations as being abnormal, nor do we see these conversations as being all that bad. In fact, as men, we often look at these conversations with a certain degree of with a certain degree of affirmation by the larger crowd of men who may look at what is taking place with a pat on the back. Am I wrong on this? Like CNN and all of these guys are looking at it with a certain condemnative finger. But if Cuomo or if Gates, or let's say any of these guys, any random guy that you throw a rock with, and you're sitting in, let's say, a sauna with another bunch of other guys, do they take issue with Gates showing these images or showing these pictures? I'm going to say no. What do you think?
They should obviously have taken issue with that. But I would say, yeah, probably not. I mean, look, yeah, I'm a guy. I've been told things by my male friends that were outrageous or, wrong. And, it's you often kind of like, you don't approve, but you keep it to yourself, maybe because you're just trying to go along to get along, or maybe you don't think that there's really anything that can or should be done about it.
Or there's a societal pressure that basically affirms that behavior. Meaning the behavior that Gates is exhibiting. Let's move away for the moment from the buying of a 17-year-old and that allegation. It goes deeper, I think, than that, to this notion of Gates was able to basically be a horn dog. But that horn dog behavior from the standpoint of men is not just normal, it is incentivized by the larger society. That's my point. That men are looked at as being sexually, we should enjoy it. We should like it. We should go for it. Women are going to be more chaste in the way that society looks at them. I'm getting to the point that said these are societal roles, and that everybody now wants to point a condemning to the finger at many of the guys, even with Trump. When Trump was saying grab him by the pee, and every guy was like, oh, that's horrible. And I kept saying to myself, every guy who's saying that's horrible knows guys that have said something like that, and they've sat there while the guy have said that. It's societal pressure, right? I mean, am I wrong on this?
But if it is, isn't this then the selective application of justice? And I'm not trying to conflate this too seriously with the actual federal investigation into alleged crimes. But if this is a constant, if this is pervasive in our society, why is Matt Gaetz now suddenly coming under pressure for it? And again, we're talking about a couple of different things, and you've turned to the sort of general cultural acclimatization to, base misogyny. Ted, I didn't want to step in too hard here. What's your take?
Well, I think that there's the context where you have to peel away status issues. I mean, what is okay or marginally acceptable for a civilian is not okay or marginally acceptable for a member of the House of Representatives who are expected to be held to the highest standard of conduct. So that's A. Then there's the issue of, for example, prostitution. We'll take away the 17-year-old, right? A lot of people, it's illegal, but I would say most women and men do not believe that sex work ought to be illegal. And so it's one of those things that, again, for a normal civilian, if a friend told me that he had engaged the services of an adult sex worker, I wouldn't in any way, shape, or form think that he was a bad person unless he was cheating on his partner. I would just think, well, that's a little weird, but that's about it. So, I mean, it's the fact that this guy is a member of the House of Representatives. I think, that makes all the difference in the world. The standard is just higher. Reminds me of when Bill Clinton's nominee, Zoe Baird, was accused of paying her nanny off the books and not paying for FICA tax and so on. Is that such a big deal among the elites? Not really, but she was up for being the nominee of a Democratic presidential administration. So therefore, she was held to a higher standard, and I think rightly so.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, none of this has been proved yet, and I don't freaking know. Again, like I said in the intro, I'm just a spectator to this stuff, and federal investigations are usually pretty tight-lipped about what they're doing, unless they're talking about Russiagate, for instance, in which apparently they think like a sieve. But we don't know. And so it seems like the accusations have metastasized in the way that they do if you're launching a sort of more wide-ranging investigation. But at the same time, the media has latched onto it, as they would, because he is an associate of Trump's, because he was a supporter of Trump's, and they vilified him. They're using this to try to bury him in the ground. And that's just patently obvious. It's right there on the surface. And so by that fact alone, I'm a little bit more hesitant to believe that, okay, there's a there with this. Now, the investigation should go on. And I'm not saying anything more than that. But I wouldn't latch onto this so readily. Just because it's politically expedient to do so doesn't make it true or right or good, and it doesn't set a good precedent for doing this to other people in society. We've got to close here, but any last comments on this, Ted?
Well, that's totally true. I mean, this is America. A man is innocent until proven guilty, even if he has some reprehensible politics. But as with Bill Cosby, when you have a preponderance of accusations, it gets harder to drive the truck through the eye of the needle, to torture a metaphor, to get to arrive at sort of a logical conclusion that there's no there.
All right, we've got to close this out. I hear you, Ted. We were joined for this segment by Ted Rall. He is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you can follow on Twitter at Ted Rall. Also check out his cartoons and articles at rall.com, rall.com. Ted, thank you for being with us. We've got to close this segment out. We'll be back on the other side with our next guest, Maj Toure, talking about Biden's executive actions today on guns. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are talking about Biden's executive actions on guns today, seeking everything from the DOJ, from laws on ghost guns. We'll get into exactly what ghost guns are. From laws on ghost guns to trying to implement model legislation for states to deal with red flag policies, to laws on what types of pistols are allowed, how they would be classified. We're getting into this. And for this segment, we are joined by Maj Toure. He's the founder of Black Guns Matter and a former NRA member, currently fundraising for the Black Guns Matter tour. He has raised more than $395,000 of his $1 million goal. You can follow Maj on Twitter at Maj Toure. That's MAJTOURE. You can follow Black Guns Matter on Twitter at BLK Guns, MATTR. And you can contribute to that tour at GoFundMe.com/BlackGunsMatter. Maj, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again for being with us. Let's get right into this. Biden's set to introduce some executive actions today, effectively announcing that the Department of Justice will be doing some stuff in the next coming months. We can get into specifically what ghost guns are, what red flag laws are, the idea with the pistols, that when you add a brace to a pistol, they're saying that you're basically making it the DOJ would be introducing a language, a process through which different states can legislate on whether, when you introduce a brace to a pistol, if it becomes a short-barreled rifle, which would make it susceptible to new laws and regulations. We can get into all of this, but first of all, what do you think about these new executive actions? Very simple. How do you see this process, Maj?
It's par for the course for Joe Biden to do anything to. It's not an accident that when there's historic amounts of African American people, and I'm isolating African Americans for the moment to make this point, Joe Biden has pushed very unconstitutional and very, let's be frank, racist propaganda and legislation his entire political career. That's what's happened. All gun control has had a basis of racism in America. So it's not, the irony isn't lost on me that as there's more black people in America and melanated beings of all ethnicities buying more firearms, a major chunk of that because of the work that we're doing and spreading the message that Black Guns Matter, as there have been record-breaking numbers month by month over the last year or so, of course Joe Biden would push the most unconstitutional, racist practice of gun control. I'm not surprised. This is Joe Biden doing what Joe Biden has done for half a century. Joe Biden, respected and gave the eulogy at Senator, Strom Thurmond's, funeral. So it's not confusing to me. I think that right now it's also very important that all of those African Americans, especially Black women, that have been new firearms purchases over the last year or a few months or however long that is, I want them to really look at if they chose to vote for this, administration, providing that their dead relative did not vote for them in this, most recent presidential election. I want them to really evaluate what this means. This means that attempting to circumnavigate the system of checks and balances, Joe Biden would in essence be attempting to turn America into a dictatorship, him being the senile dictator. And that in turn would make all of or a vast majority of the purchases that have happened, those purchasers would be potentially felons overnight with the stroke of a pen. So I think it's par for the course. I'm not surprised, but I think people should look into that. And this is why I tell people you should be looking at the actual issues and the policies and the legislation, not just the personality, or not just because television says, you're a Democrat because you live in a Black neighborhood. So it's par for the course for me. I'm surprised at how few law enforcement officers on a local, state, and federal level are speaking up against this. Now is the perfect time for them to be holding their oath to the Constitution or identifying themselves as, down with the Gestapo tactics.
Well, Todd, real quick, I'm just so I'm clear. I'm slightly confused. What specifically do you believe that Joe Biden is passing from a standpoint of gun legislation that is racist and that is basically puts him on the level of, I suppose, Hitler, since we're talking about Gestapo tactics? What is what's the policy specifically? Just so I'm clear.
Not what I said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to straw man. I just want to get it right. You said it was Gestapo tactics. And look, and I'm not even entirely disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to nail down what we're talking about specifically. What policies specifically that Joe Biden is pushing forward that
I'm gonna let you go, and you let me know when you finish so I can give you the response.
Okay, fair enough. I'm just asking you what specifically are the policies that Joe Biden is pushing that you believe are going to, Gestapo tactics in a way that you're saying, the words that were used?
You're asking a layered question, and you're asking for specific. So you're asking me what are the Gestapo tactics, and I also have to clarify that I didn't say I'm not one of those lefties that are just because I disagree with somebody's policy, I'm calling them Hitler. So I got to clarify what you said there. That's not what I said. Okay. On top of the fact that you're asking me, let me finish up. You're asking me two separate questions and asking me, so I want to address them, specifically. So specifically, when you're talking about policy that what's his name, Biden authored, the Tough on Crime 1994 bills. He contributed to the 1990s, mass incarceration. We're talking about the 1984 law called the Comprehensive Control Act, and that's the one that he actually, co-authored. He got real, bipartisan or nonpartisan and linked up with his friend, since the Republicans supposedly are so bad, that's the one that he co-authored with Strom Thurmond. And these are things that deliberately sponsored the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which means not guys that were selling drugs, even though that we know that the war on drugs is a complete failure, right? Not even just people selling drugs, people that were addicted to drugs. So those are some of the things in the past that he's done, specific legislation, not getting to the firearms portion of it yet. However, that specific legislation that he either co-authored or authored himself that disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. So that I
agree with you. I agree 1,000% with you on that. I'm trying to get to the gun legislation, though. Like, what specifically in the gun legislation?
So in the gun legislation scenario, when you have someone that's deliberately saying literally calling for. First, you got to go back a bit. All gun control in America is rooted in racism. That is a fact. When you're talking about America at some point being a constitutional carry state, all of it was at some point, meaning you have a gun because you can buy a gun. Simple. As soon as black people fought for their liberation from enslavement, state-sponsored and sanctioned slavery, that's what happened in our great nation. We can't shy away from that fact. Our government sanctioned slavery when black people and really cool white abolitionists and Native Americans, all of these people fought, won a war. Now here comes the gun control law. You got states like North Carolina that literally amended their state constitution, basically, in this part I'm going to paraphrase a bit, literally amended their state constitution saying, going from, all men can have firearms, and then really going back and amending that saying all white men, literally creating all of the gun control, the basis for all of the gun control that we see now. Now, when you fast forward, and we know that that's rooted in that, that's a fact. That's not my opinion, right? So when we look at that, and then we fast forward, or, all over the map, all over the timeline, when you're talking about the first federal gun grab, Wounded Knee, that murdered and massacred a bunch of indigenous people to this land. We call them Native Americans, right? When we're talking about all of these rules, the black codes, the slave codes, were deliberately, not only with firearms, deliberately said if a white man comes upon a black man that has something that looks like an arm, he's within his rights to kill that person. This is the basis of that. And so now you can fast forward, and some people will say, well, all ethnicities are impacted by gun control. Well, racism in that form, it's not politically correct to say, we don't want you blacks and you Asians and you Chinese people, and it's politically incorrect to say that. But when you look at the outcome of who is impacted by this gun control in America, going to jail for possession of firearms, charged, time given on the books, it is overwhelmingly black and brown communities. The outcome hasn't changed. They're just better at saying it. So when you have a sweeping ability of a president to then circumnavigate the entire system of checks and balances, and their primary goal is targeting gun control, and we know where those communities that are impacted the most by that legislation, black communities, which the origin of it was, then they're just calling racism something else in the name of public safety. They're switching their languaging to, the gun safety movement. That's not what it is. It's about generating revenue for the state and continuing the policy of targeting communities.
That's
Otis McDonald.
Taj, that's a little extreme. So I can agree with you up to a point. Meaning, I can agree with you. Like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan gets concerned when all those black people say they're going to use guns, and a Republican passes gun legislation for Ronald Reagan during those terms. So fair enough, but to extrapolate that and say all is typically problematic. And when you have a situation where all of these people have been getting killed en masse, and it wasn't like these were black shooters. I mean, most of these shooters were white, and the country, large part of the country says things need to be done for guns. And the political actors basically says prayers. Look, it is the job of the political space to get involved in things where the country is screaming that it wants assistance on. And so even if I can agree up to a point about some of the legislation and everything that was passed with the idea and the effects of that legislation, then you lose me when a large number of people are being killed. Those shooters aren't necessarily black. And the point of it, the impetus of it, has nothing to do with race in that case. I guess I'm saying, even though I understand where you're coming from, the context that you're using for it, I disagree that each and every one of these situations are going to end up being a response on some level or related to race. And this is one of those cases where I don't believe is related to race. Am I wrong in that? Like when the killings take place, when you see a large number of people get killed at once, a mass shooting, and the government responds, do you believe that the government response is related to race, or do you believe it's related to the killing that took place?
Nothing to do with me. If they don't understand the line, on top of the fact that all of this legislation is unconstitutional in the first place, the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights is extremely clear. It's extremely clear.
Right, to form militias.
Bear arms
malicious.
And all of these 20,000 laws Here's people trying to defend the thing that mathematically we have the data that the people that have been targeted and have been mostly impacted negatively by this unconstitutional legislation that literally was started. Literally stopped Black and brown people from having the means to defend themselves. If someone can't understand that line of actions and deeds and they lose me somewhere, I'm not trying to get you.
Wait, so just so I'm clear, if the person disagrees with you, you're not even going to try to get that person if they don't quite get where you're coming from on that. That's pretty extreme. Look, the point that I'm making here is that even if you can show that there's an outsized effects on African Americans on previous gun legislation, I think it is out there to make the case that A, it's unconstitutional to pass it, which is not. The Supreme Court has made it clear that the states and whatnot could put restrictions. I mean, the person can't walk around with a nuclear weapon or can't walk around with a pot-belly helicopter that can go down and gun people. So the precedent had already been set that there can be limits that are placed on it. It's not unconstitutional. That's the point.
I think his argument, we've got to close it out here, but I think his argument is that is unconstitutional.
It's not.
I mean, again,
if the Supreme Court is arguing and saying it is not, then it's not unconstitutional by definition.
No, because people can still argue that the Supreme Court has made unconstitutional decisions in the past in the same way that you can have different interpretations of the Bible or whatever. You can have people who are saying that the original text as it was written
I know,
is not
Shane, but that doesn't really mean anything. Anybody can say anything is wrong. I'm making the point that the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and he's basically saying, I think the Supreme Court is wrong, which you can do, but let's just be clear that it's ruled on it.
We've got to close it out, folks. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with headlines in our last hour this morning.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. It is time now for another edition of the most disruptive, another hour, our last hour of the most disruptive show covering American news, events, politics, and more. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning has gone well and continues to go well. To give people a brief roundup of today's show, at 7:30, we spoke with Stephen Lenman about the battle, the sort of simmering conflict in Ukraine with troop movements back and forth, both on the Ukrainian side and more recently the Russian side, what that means for the region and the world. At 8:15, we spoke with Garland Nixon about the Derek Chauvin trial and the significance of the blue wall supposedly crumbling. Both of them were sort of skeptical about the idea that that's actually happening, saying, this is, Jamarl, I believe you were saying, they're effectively cutting bait on Chauvin. They, as an institution, have decided it is not worth standing up for this guy, and we need to sort of realign ourselves with him on the other side of the wall. And Garland saying that this is going to be limited, agreeing with you, I believe, and then saying that this is going to be limited to this instance. This is not, revealing some wider shift in the policy of police or the attitudes of police across the country when it comes to protecting each other. After that, we spoke with Ted Rall about Matt Gaetz, Florida representative and a longtime supporter of Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, as Gaetz has come under investigation and wide public scrutiny in the media over allegations that he is guilty of sex trafficking, over allegations that he had sex with a 17-year-old girl, and more recently, allegations that he solicited women, brought women to the Bahamas with the idea that he would engage in sex with them, which would be illegal the way that he did that, assuming he did it for a second, and I'm still skeptical. And we just finished up a contentious conversation with Maj Toure about Biden's executive actions on guns and the history of gun rights and gun restrictions in America. Later this hour, we're going to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We're going to be talking about the IMF calling for a wealth tax and the question, what would it take to get rid of poverty in the USA? But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, yesterday saw at least 2,564 new coronavirus deaths and 73,200 new cases reported in the United States. Over the past week, there has been an average of 65,556 cases per day. That's an increase of 14% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,944,100 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Over 558,000 have been killed by it. Yesterday, EU leaders failed to come to an agreement on how the AstraZeneca vaccine should be distributed among the bloc's member countries. This comes after the European Medicines Agency has come out saying that blood clots should be listed as a very rare side effect of the vaccine, with approximately 1 in 250,000 suffering the symptoms, according to the head of the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency in the UK. Germany has limited the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine to people over the age of 60 and to high-priority groups. France and Belgium are only administering the vaccine to people aged 55 and over. Finland, meanwhile, has restricted its use to those over the age of 65. In other European countries, in other European Union countries, they have not yet placed age limits on the vaccine. The South American country of Argentina will implement an overnight curfew until the end of this month. That curfew starts this Friday. It comes as the country is seeing a spike in COVID cases, with a record 22,039 new infections reported in the previous day, up from a record of 20,870 the day before. So 2 increasingly record-setting days for COVID infections in Argentina. That message, the overnight curfew message, was delivered by Argentina's President Alberto Fernandez from his private residence, where he is self-isolating after having contracted the virus. Some 4.5 million Argentinians have received at least one dose of a coronavirus vaccine so far. Meanwhile, the country of Poland has logged over 950 deaths. That is its highest single-day death toll in the country yet. Disney World in Orlando, back here in the States, is lightening its requirements on mask use slightly by allowing visitors to the theme park to remove their masks when taking pictures outdoors, including pictures with characters from the theme park. Think Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, etc., as long as they're, again, outdoors and also socially distanced. In national political news, the chief prosecution investigator at the trial of Derek Chauvin has reversed part of his evidence. In a film from the death of George Floyd, the prosecutor had originally referenced Floyd as saying, quote, "I ate too many drugs," end quote, but has since revised the statement as Floyd saying, "I ain't done no drugs," quote, end quote. The defense is arguing that the main cause of Floyd's death was drug use, with the prosecution arguing that the cause of death was Derek Chauvin's knee being pressed against Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. President Biden is set to unveil 6 executive actions on gun control and gun violence today. Those actions specifically are aimed at restricting the use of ghost guns, attempting to get more states to introduce red flag laws, and restricting the use of modified pistols. The Department of Justice is also expected to issue its first comprehensive report on gun trafficking in over 20 years, since the year 2000. Ghost guns, by the way, are guns made untraceable by the lack of a serial number, usually produced from kits containing most of the components of guns, along with assembly instructions. As far as I can tell, often these ghost guns, are usually produced by 3D printers. They're often produced by 3D printers. And again, it's legal to sell the different components of guns as long as you sell most of them and leave out, I believe it's the receiver that you have to leave out. You have to leave out certain parts of them, otherwise it's illegal to sell them as a package. But if you sell most of them, then people basically can put them together on their own, buy the last remaining parts, and they are left with a gun untraceable due to its lack of a serial number. Within 60 days, the Department of Justice is also expected to release model legislation for states on red flag laws. Those would allow police or family members to petition courts to remove firearms from people in a state of crisis. Within 60 days, the DOJ would also issue a proposed rule that would allow pistols equipped with a brace or other stabilizing device to be reclassified as short-barreled rifles, which would make them subject to the requirements of the National Firearms Act. Biden is also set to nominate David Chipman to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. In an article published at the Washington Post yesterday, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia wrote that, quote, "there is no circumstance," end quote, in which he would vote to eliminate or weaken the filibuster, also saying that he does, quote, "not believe budget reconciliation should replace regular order," end quote. And continuing here, Manchin wrote that, quote, "every time the Senate voted to weaken the filibuster in the past decade, the political dysfunction and gridlock have grown more severe He continued, generations of senators who came before us put their heads down and their pride aside to solve the complex issues facing our country. We must do the same, end quote. Now, Jamarl and I had an extensive back and forth for like 6 or 7 minutes or something at the top of the show, back at about, I guess, 7:08, something like that. We did that then. I've got more headlines, so I don't want to get too deep into it now. But Jamarl, any quick comments before I move on?
Yeah, like I made the point before, the filibuster, the filibuster didn't used to function in the way that it functions now. Back in the old days, the moment that a filibuster was called, all business in the Senate stopped. There weren't these multiple tracks in which people can kind of do legislation. And somewhere along the way, somebody said, hey, why don't we make it where there could be multiple tracks? So you can have a filibuster and people still continue to do other work. Well, at that point, they were like, all right, well, fine. A filibuster can maintain and it could sustain itself. Imagine for the moment if everything stopped, the moment that somebody called a filibuster, as opposed to now, where people could have multiple tracks of business and you can just say, okay, I don't want to do that. Meaning we've created such ease in which people can call the filibuster that 60 votes become required to get anything done in Congress. That's not the way it should be. That's not the way it was. It's the way it became as the filibuster became easier to use. No, there's already an advantage for the minority in the Senate. It's called California being the size of the 5th largest economy in the world, but only getting 2 votes in the Senate, just like Iowa or Idaho or one of the other smaller states. You don't need the secondary advantage of the 60 vote threshold. And that is part and parcel to why a lot of stuff doesn't get done. And so, yeah, get rid of it. I don't think you need it. And Joe Manchin is just trying to find some reason for him to, be able to be the doom bringer and the power broker in the Senate. He's full of it. He's nonsense. It's not real. And I would even go further. The reason that Joe Manchin is even in power in West Virginia on some level has to do with the intransigence in Congress. I would even go further. I would even go there. Because what happens if West Virginia had a policy that people said, look, we're not going to have this thing where we're going to try to get rid of coal without having a different pathway? Meaning you can push through a Green New Deal and have a pathway to states like West Virginia to not end up dirt poor as you move away from coal. They just don't do that. No, I don't think the filibuster is necessary. Get rid of it. Other states, other countries don't have it. You have parliaments in other countries, they get along just fine. We do the same.
All right. I could respond, but I want to move into other headlines here real quick. Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota said that President Biden's plan to continue constructing segments of President Trump's, quote, xenophobic and racist wall, end quote, is, quote, shameful and unacceptable, end quote.
And funny.
After DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas told staff to prepare to fill in some unfinished sections of the wall along America's southern border. When asked about the issue, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that the administration was considering the use of previously allocated funds and said that, quote, that Biden is, quote, proposing an investment in smart security at the border, what we see as 21st century solutions for border management, end quote. I'm just imagining tasers, although realistically they're probably thinking like surveillance and cameras and stuff. But imagine just like an electrified taser wall that people struggle to walk into, that lights tumbleweeds on fire. That'd be a good look.
I'm in the mind for alligators and a moat. Alligators and a moat. Let's go back to the old style.
That would indeed be a 21st century solution for sure. I think if you put lasers on the alligators, actually, then you're a step away from the old Austin Powers trope with sharks with lasers on their head, which I think alligators would fare in the desert moat a little bit better than sharks would. But hey, what do I know? New Mexico and New York City have both ended qualified immunity for police officers. Qualified immunity, by the way, shields officers from liability even if the conduct is illegal. This fits into the conversation we were having earlier on with Garland Nixon. Again, back at 8:15 a.m. Eastern, we were talking about the Chauvin trial. We got into this. His take, I believe, was, okay, you've seen some action, but he also mentioned a bill in Kentucky that would make it illegal for people to insult police officers. So he was saying, this isn't part of necessarily a wider wave. You're probably going to see it on a state-by-state basis, but it's part of the wider culture war conflict. Therefore, this isn't like a massive sea change happening this year or next year. It's going to be a little bit more regional, and that fits. I can see that being true too. Possession of small amounts of marijuana will be made legal in the state of Virginia on July 1st later this year. Starting later this year, adults under the age of 21 will be allowed to possess an ounce or under of marijuana. In international news, Myanmar's ambassador to the UK says his embassy in London has been occupied by the country's military and that he has been locked out of the building. He has opposed the military coup government since February 1st when they detained and effectively deposed the sitting government of Myanmar, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who has faced a series of charges along with several other prominent politicians in the country. Protest movements have swept the country, and protesters have been killed by the coup regime in large numbers, with the total number of deaths passing 500 last week. After spending last night in his car, the ambassador asked the UK not to recognize his replacement. I just imagine what that dude's life is right now, is like right now. And that's, I think I would about pretty much anybody who's locked out of the building, any building, their home, their workplace, and then is forced to sleep the night in a car. It's just, you know, it is it's vivid imagery. I guess that's how I'll put it. But also a serious circumstance as, again, this is the coup regime taking over the embassy in London. We're not talking about in Myanmar. We're talking about in the UK, with military officials, I'm sure, sweeping in and sending people to remove him from the building. Will the UK go along with it? And that, of course, is the key question. That's what the ambassador is asking them not to do. But this is, after all, their city. I think if they wanted to, well, you know, there's certain laws about this stuff. We'll see how this works out.
Wait, just so I'm clear. The Myanmar, just so I'm clear, this is in the UK, and this is
in the UK. This is in the city of London.
How do they allow that?
Well,
I mean, because think about what I'm saying here. If the military government, if the United States and the other countries consider the coup government as being illegitimate, why accept this within the context of the UK?
Well, that's a good question, but I think that's what this hinges on, is whether or not the UK is going to, you know, cross that Rubicon in terms of rendering their judgment that it is an illegitimate government.
Oh,
so this
man,
just
that is so weird. Because think of what happened in the United States with Venezuela. Yep. And the way that we had no issue with taking the Venezuelan embassy. I mean, and giving it over to, what Guaido? Guaido didn't win a pie shop contest. No issue.
No.
Same thing with Ecuador. But with Ecuador, it's a little different. They basically browbeat Moreno into giving up Assange. So that's a little bit different. But that's really weird. That's really interesting. What do you think about that? Like, should they pass judgment on whether or not...
Yes, they should pass judgment. It's in their country. They can determine which public officials from which other countries they're going to deal with. That's my take. And maybe that's biased, and maybe it's just because
No. That's not biased or anything. I don't know. I'm unclear on this one. Part of me thinks that you're right, that it's their discretion on who's in charge of a particular government. I guess on some level, especially if it's in their country, even if that's considered foreign territory, but it's considered foreign territory kind of with a wink and a nod in a sense. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe you're right. I think I'm more on side on you on this one. That if they don't believe that the coup government should take power, then maybe they shouldn't give the coup government the embassy.
Damn it, we agree. That's never fun. I'm just kidding. We gotta close the headlines out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are our headlines. We'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Professor Richard Wolff, starting off with a conversation on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, calling for a wealth tax to make light the situations of countries hit hard by COVID. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back with Professor Wolff in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Welcome back to Faultlines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we are joined by Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a visiting professor at the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University, New York City. He is founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, and is available with other books including Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism. Professor, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. I always enjoy bringing you on. So, the IMF. This is an interesting thing to me. The IMF is basically trying to deal with the issue of inequality. And it basically says, quote, to meet the pandemic-related financing needs, policymakers could consider a temporary COVID recovery contribution leveled on high incomes or wealth, the fiscal monitor said. Quote, to accumulate the resources needed to improve access to basic services, enhance safety nets, and reinvigorate efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, domestic and international tax reforms are necessary, especially as the recovery gains momentum. Here's my question. And I'll just keep going for a moment. At a press conference to launch the fiscal monitor, a senior IMF official said that there was scope in rich countries to target those individuals and companies that had prospered during the pandemic. Professor Wolff, the weird part about this to me has a lot to do with the notion that, let's say the pandemic didn't happen. Let's say there was no COVID. What is the difference between countries being able to levy that tax and levy the resources of those monstrous wealths? I mean, for God's sake, in the United States, 95% of the income gains was won by the top 1% under Obama. So it's not just under COVID that those gains take place, or that those gains have taken place. In normal, everyday, physical matter reality, without COVID, those gains also exist. What is the difference between leveling that great wealth to deal with the inequalities and the inequities of our current system among people that need it the most, whether we have COVID or not? I guess I'm asking, why is the IMF so on it about, all right, we need to do something now that there's COVID, but what about when there wasn't COVID and you still had those people in dire need? Why is one necessary, but the other one gets ignored, if that makes sense?
Sure. Excuse me. It's a perfectly appropriate question. And I think the answer is pretty straightforward as well. During the Obama years, or for that matter, during the Bush years before Obama, and in fact, for the last 30 to 40 years, inequality in the United States and in many other capitalist countries kept getting greater and greater. The gap between rich and poor deeper and deeper. And the IMF never said a word. In fact, it encouraged all kinds of policies that it knew perfectly well made inequality worse. So you have to look for the answer in what has happened since then that might change them. And sure, they refer to the pandemic because everybody refers to the pandemic these days, no matter what they're pushing. But the reality is, and I know this is hard for Americans to swallow, is that the reason the IMF is now suddenly on the side of taxing highest incomes or high wealth is because they're afraid of what is going to happen if they don't. I mean, over the last 3 or 4 days, the head of Morgan Stanley Bank Jamie Dimon, has urged politicians in America to get more involved. And he did that in order to support decisions like Major League Baseball moving its All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver. He did that because he is opposed, as so many CEOs are, to the kinds of measures to restrict voting that are going on in virtually every state house in the United States, pushed always by the GOP, et cetera, et cetera. They're afraid that the splitting of this society, the kinds of hostilities, angers, bitternesses that erupted on January 6th are part of a disintegration of this system. And they are persuaded that the inequality we have is a root contributor to all of that. So they want that addressed. And so they're no longer playing footsie with the old conservative notion that it's never appropriate to tax rich people or big corporations. They're done with that. That did not work. That made the problem worse. And they're now scared, and they're running scared. And, you know, the irony of Mitch McConnell, the head of the GOP, punishing CEOs as he did a few days ago, telling them to stay out of politics, a rich idea from a man who has been collecting money from these big corporations all of his political life. But he's now upset that he's the leader of a party that the rest of the business world sees as an obstacle to the kind of settled, quiet, unified, non-Civil War oriented public. That's the way they want to do business. They don't want to have to worry about if they do this, they'll be boycotted by that group. If they do that, they'll be boycotted by the other, which is now the reality. They see the writing on the wall. So does everybody else who isn't blind. And they want to do something. And suddenly their representatives, like the leaders of the IMF, are going to give them support. Yes, go tax the rich. Jeffrey Bezos, who is the richest man on this planet, had to deliver over the last week, biting his tongue, an advocacy for greater taxes on corporations. So you can see these are people who never did this before. And you're quite right to bring up the question why. And the answer is they've gone too far. A few years ago, Warren Buffett told them, don't let this continue, this deepening inequality. And here we have 1 year of pandemic during which the richest 600 Americans, who are billionaires, increased their collective wealth by nearly another $1 trillion, while more than a third of the American labor force had to experience unemployment for 1 or more weeks during this last year. This kind of difference for the rich versus everybody else is socially disruptive and is dangerous for the capitalism that requires a more or less peaceful society in which to function.
Professor Wolf, if the argument, if the policies we're talking about were going to be restricted to a redistribution of wealth from the already very wealthy to the predominantly poor public, certainly relative to the very wealthy, I would be on board with it. But what I'm worried about, and maybe this is a uniquely American, maybe it's a parochial concern, but I can see these concerns being picked up by people in many other countries, is that that income, that money, will be taken up by the government and used effectively, in many cases, for handouts. Here in the States, my mind goes to the military-industrial complex and Wall Street, where, again, too much money has been spent on both to have very good little effect on either end. On Wall Street, of course, it props up the financial bubble. With the military-industrial complex, I would argue it props up a military bubble. But regardless, that's not infrastructure. We're not talking about free healthcare. We're not talking about innovative new systems for resolving people's needs. We're talking about a corrupt political system spending loads of money in self-dealing and self-serving deals across the board. And I'm worried that same thing, well, yeah, again, those are the sort of American versions of it. But if you look at other more developed and even less developed countries, I'm sure many of the same concerns would apply. How do you view that, Professor Wolf?
Well, first of all, let me just tell you, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I think you're absolutely right that if you tax the rich, if you tax the corporations, you are only dealing with half the problem. If you do not alter the basic way government spends the money that it raises, you will undo in the act of spending what you were trying to accomplish in the act of taxing the rich. And the reason is very simple. And you're invoking other countries is exactly right here. The reason is when governments spend money, most of what they do, particularly in societies that stress private capitalism, like the United States or the United Kingdom or other countries, mostly of that money goes into contracts given by the government to private corporations to undertake, if you want to talk infrastructure, undertake a road building or a bridge repair or what have you. If you want to go into the health area, develop a vaccine or and when you give money to large corporations, they do with that money what they have always tried to do with that money, namely feather their own nest. Up go the dividends to their shareholders, up go the pay package to their top executives, up go their very funding of the political system that gets them those contracts in the first place. Look, since 1945, the United States has given foreign aid, as have other countries, to many, many countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The goal was always to help them develop. Well, unfortunately, in many of those countries, most of that money was squirreled away either in the hands of the political authorities to whom the money was given or their cronies in the business world to whom they gave the cushy contracts. We all know this story. The irony of the last 75 years is that the one country that never got U.S. foreign aid, the People's Republic of China, has outperformed all of the countries in terms of economic growth that got foreign aid from the United States to help them grow. That irony should not be lost on anyone. So you're right. You're going to raise more money from the rich, and I certainly support it. But if you don't change how you deliver that extra wealth into the hands of the public that needs it, and your examples are as good as any. Let me give you one more. In the 1930s, when we had a situation roughly like what we have now, the government of the United States didn't just give contracts to big corporations. It gave them plenty, more than it should have, but it didn't just do that. It set up a hiring program. 15 million Americans were immediately transformed from unemployed people into employed people and put to work building our national parks that we've all been visiting with great joy in the years in between, doing the first conservation work in this country on a mass scale, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Not that those programs didn't have problems, they did, but they were a much more direct way of making sure that help is given to the mass of the people, not held hostage by being given to the private corporations. And then we're all surprised to discover 2, 4, 6 years from now that they didn't do 90% of what was intended when all of this was undertaken.
And Professor Wolf, you chose a couple of good examples there because they strike my heart dearly. The national park system was actually a fairly well-run institution throughout its history. So I hear you on that. We need to go to a break, though. We're joined by Professor Richard D. Wolf, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show Economic Update, and his latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Professor Wolf on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for the second half of this segment is one of my favorite guests, Professor Richard D. Wolff. He's professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University, New York City. He is founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, and is available with other books, including Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism at www.democracyatwork.info. His monthly show is one of my favorites. So, Professor, again, thank you for continuing to join us.
Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So one of the conversations that came up had to do with, as we were alluding to in a previous segment, the idea that the IMF basically was saying, hey, maybe we need to do something about this inequality stuff. This looks kind of bad. And I would imagine their reasoning has to do with the destabilizing impact of that inequality, not necessarily to help the public, because if they wanted to, they could have done that going back for the last several decades. I mean, after all, the majority of the population around the world lives off, what, like $10 a day or something? I think it's like 60%. I may be getting the number wrong, but that number is up there. Not to mention a large percentage off at like $2 a day. They could have done this at any point. So the question becomes, even if we're taking this just to the section of the United States, how will we go about getting rid of poverty? Now, China has done it. I think it was earlier, either this year or at the very end of last year, where they announced that they got rid of extreme poverty. How would we do that in the United States? What would that look like? And what would that look like mechanically if we went through the process of saying we're going to get rid of extreme poverty or poverty in general in the United States? Professor, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think if the eradication of poverty were the target, and before I answer, let me explain. So far, all the IMF is lip service. In other words, the IMF leadership, like so many, wants to convey the notion that they actually care about inequality because it is socially destabilizing, which they can clearly see now, and they figure it's necessary to say something about it. My guess is, based on past history, that they hope that saying something will be enough, that their fear is that they will, in fact, have to do something and not just say something, but that whether they will or not remains to be seen. And that has been the problem here in the United States about poverty. Roughly every 20 years in the United States, we as a nation rediscover, oh my goodness, we have a poverty program. In between, we tell ourselves how we're eradicating poverty. Most of the time, that is straight out BS. What it means really is that we've gone on to focus on other things and that the poor people are quietly being poor wherever they do that. It's when the poor make a lot of noise, when the poor get in your face, that suddenly we have someone write a book or go on TV and announce to us, oh my goodness, I did some research and wow, have we got a lot of poor people in the United States. And we're seeing it now again as folks realize that this pandemic and the crash of our economic system that happened with it have made a lot more people poor than were already poor before. So when you ask, what do we have to do? The first part of the answer is we've got to do more or different things than we've done in the past because we have not eradicated the poverty, even though we've rediscovered it literally every 20 years for at least the last century. What would I suggest? Well, here's the way my brain works on this subject. Most of all, we need people to have a job. I'm talking about healthy adults, et cetera, to have a job that pays them a decent income. The minute you do that, you have taken probably the single most important step. Give people a job, an important task that they can look good to themselves in the mirror in the morning. I'm on my way to do something that is socially useful. I'm a valuable person, and I'm recognized as that because I get a decent income that allows me to pay my rent, to feed my family, and to be an upstanding citizen in this community.
Well, and see yourself that way. What you're getting at is seeing yourself that way too.
That's right. You want to see yourself, but it's very hard to see yourself that way if you're sitting on the stoop, wondering where your next $5 is going to come from. You need to do something useful and to be recognized for doing that. And that means getting a decent income, not $7.25 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage. That is an insult to your labor. It's telling you, whether folks like this or not, that you're not worth anything. And that is a devastating thing for a human being to have to confront every day of his or her life. So that would be the place I would start. But I would also say you have to change the organization of enterprises. This is going to be perhaps difficult for some of your listeners to swallow. But there has to be a new way of deciding how you divide the income that an enterprise gets. I'm talking whether it's a factory or an office or a store. You bring in money by what you sell, what you produce, you deliver a service, whatever it is you do, you earn revenue. Now the question is, who decides how to distribute the revenue of any enterprise among all the people who work in that enterprise? The way we have it now is a tiny minority. The owner of the business, if it's a corporation, the board of directors, who are typically somewhere between 12 and 20 persons, they make that decision. And then we claim to be surprised when we allow a tiny minority at the top of the business to make the decision about how to distribute their revenues, and we discover they distribute most of them to themselves. Hello? How surprising is that? If you don't want that to happen, if you don't want Jeffrey Bezos to have $177 billion, that's the latest number attributed to him by Forbes magazine as the richest person on the planet, while the employees at Amazon can't pay for their kids to go to college, if you don't want that, then you have to change the way wealth is distributed as it comes in initially as revenue to an enterprise. And one of the reasons I'm an advocate for worker cooperatives is simply I believe in democracy. I would like all the workers in an enterprise, whether they sweep up at night after the office is closed, or they work on a machine, or they're a supervisor of some activity, one person, one vote, let's divide up the work. And if some people have gone to school for a long time and they need to recover those costs, okay, they get paid a bit more. And if others didn't, okay, they get paid a bit less. I think human beings are quite reasonable, especially in these kinds of groups. The majority will rule. But what I know would never happen in such a democratic system would be that the people would all vote to give Jeffrey Bezos, just to pick on him, $177 billion out of the Amazon revenue, while other people can't send their kids to college. I mean, that's not going to happen. However unequal they might distribute it, they won't do that. And that would be, in my judgment, a way to really settle into to really create the structure which would create less inequality, much less than what we have seen our current system impose on us.
I know, Professor Wolf, I hear you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. If you were to look at the economic distribution within companies, but also just across the board in the United States, it would look much more like the Eiffel Tower than a pyramid. It would have a fat bottom and a very thin, tall top, where the number of people who are making, the most money by far reside at the top of that, and then it gets less and less. You go down until you find the bulk of the population at the bottom. It's not like it's a linear scale going up. But here's where I would go at this. You mentioned factories, offices, and stores earlier. Part of the problem that I see that I want to get your take on is that we have far more offices and stores than we do factories. With the position of the United States dollar internationally, it's made us an importing nation running constant trade deficits. Now we're able to offset those by picking up, selling other nations our debt, basically. But regardless, what it means is that at home, we have a lack of productive enterprises. Manufacturing, even though we have a manufacturing base, the bulk of the jobs have shifted away from that to other countries overseas. And I would argue, this is my sort of unique case, maybe, that has led to long-term degradation on R&D, the technology, the thing that ultimately pushes civilizations forward on this deep material level. It means that instead of pursuing those heights and trying to make our civilization and our society truly revolutionary in its ability to provide the basic needs for people, we've sort of stagnated in this long-run 50-year period dating back to the late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in that era, sometime around the Nixon shock. That's my unique case. But just generally, with manufacturing, with baseline productivity, how do you see that fitting in? Do you see that as a necessity, or do you see this more as a division of labor where we can do our thing, other countries do theirs? How do you see it, Professor Wolf?
Well, for me, the answer is, first of all, I agree with you again. I think manufacturing is something we should have conserved here for all kinds of reasons. You've mentioned some. I could easily mention all of the communities that depended on manufacturing, as well as this question of R&D, as well as the question of having a balanced economy. The future is uncertain. You don't want to be all locked in with your eggs in one basket. You want your eggs distributed. And the economic baskets are manufacturing and services and so on. So I agree with you. But I want to be clear with everybody why it happened. This is a result of capitalism. Capitalism tells each capitalist, make the most money. We will reward you if you do, and we will punish you in the competitive struggle if you don't. And the capitalists of America said we can make more profit by paying Chinese workers way less than what we pay American workers. So we're going over there and take advantage of the low wages, take advantage that theirs is a much faster growing economy than the U.S., and we want to be where the growth is. So they left. They made a decision which was in their interest, doing what capitalism has always taught them to do. And if we don't want this to continue, let alone we want to reverse it, we got to deal with the capitalist system, because that in the end is what made all of that happen. And we're now living with the disastrous consequences.
Professor Wolf, thank you for this. We're out of time, but I really appreciate you joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Glad to talk with you.
Glad to talk with you. For those listening, that was the voice of Professor Richard D. Wolf. He is the professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University, NYC. He's also the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. And that book is available along with his other books at Understanding Socialism, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism at democracyatwork.info. You can also follow Professor Wolf on Twitter at Prof. Wolf, and that is Wolf with 2 F's at the end. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking your calls when we come back, 202-521-1320. See you in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements what's shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. And we're in the rap segment. That's the last segment for the show today. By the way, just giving you a quick heads up, if you guys live in the D.C. area, you can catch us on the radio there. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. And if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down every morning here, whatever platform you are consuming this content on, please do give it a like, share it. If you want to join us, you can. And particularly now, you can either chat, tweet, or, of course, in this segment, reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement definitely does help to make this show what it is, so please do not be shy. Feel free to call, get in touch with us. Also, as always, I have my email address standing open. If you have tips or leads on stories, feel free to send them, shanestranahan@gmail.com. Any commentary on the show, criticism, compliments, and again, leads, please do send them my way. And again, we're now taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. We have calling in right now Will from Chicago, 202-521-1320 if you want to join. Will, calling in from Chicago, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, guys. How's it going? Thanks, as always. Great show. I wanted to cite this study I was looking at. Basically, in Finland, they found that the inclusion of greener play areas for kids outside of schools had an immune-boosting effect. Okay, so in the context of the Green New Deal, it seems like a win-win-win. You give economic stability for families. You give antidepressive effects for the employees who feel like they're building a better, greener America. You give healthier kids healthier lives. You know, so I guess my question is, if we're going to do a Green New Deal and expand parks for you know, urban and suburban areas, which industries sort of, I guess I wanted to talk to Richard Wolff. He's not here anymore, but maybe Jamarl could like channel him. Which industries are most opposed to the Green New Deal and why? Maybe you don't know.
Oil and gas. Oil and gas, easy. Because from the standpoint of the Green New Deal is looking for a way of saying, how do we make our world and how do we make our country utilize energy in a way that doesn't or is not deleterious to the environment? Now, I would argue that one of the reasons that Joe Manchin is in power in West Virginia is because of Joe Manchin's position on coal, oil, and gas, whereas West Virginia is looking at the Democratic Party as being hostile to those interests. Well, what if you weren't hostile to those interests? What if you was like, oh yeah, we don't like oil and gas, but we're going to put provisions in that area where we're going to ensure that you're going to be able to move to a job that is not oil and gas, that you're going to be proud about, that it's going to make higher wages or just as good as wages. Meaning you got to be able, those people aren't insane for saying we don't like your policies now that your policies are adversely affecting our ability to make cash. And those industries, even employees, will be against it if you're going to say or do things that are going to adversely affect their situation. So if you're Obama, or if you're Hillary Clinton, or if you're pick a random Democrat, and you're attacking oil and gas and coal, what are the people in North and West Virginia going to think? Those people are going to destroy my livelihood. They're not insane for that. And so, yeah, oil and gas would be adversely affected by a Green New Deal. Especially if you're talking about more wind farms, you're talking about solar panel on people's houses so they don't have to use the energy that would typically be done for oil and gas. Yes, that energy would be greatly impacted. There would be billions of dollars that they won't be getting, and they would have issues with it. Am I wrong, Shane? Like, can you think of another industry on that front? That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of industries that are on the front line of getting hit by Green New Deal legislation. Like, for one thing, for example, solar panels. Say Joe Biden went through and said, we are going to pay people, Americans, good, decent money to go all throughout America, and anybody that has a house that wants solar power on it, we're going to pay for that. We're going to give tax credits for that. We're going to cover the cost of that. And we're going to pay good Americans to go through and put it through. Think of 50 states and think of the money that gets saved the moment that those people don't have to pay their oil and gas bill when they are getting solar power brought to their houses with maybe a battery pack to save that solar power during the course of the day, where each of those houses are energy independent and those people are no longer paying $150 a month for energy bills. What does it do to the oil and gas companies that would typically be getting money for those costs? It will be dramatic for climate stuff. And yeah, in the beginning, there'll be this uptick in the amount of energy that's being used because you still have to produce the items. The items that are being produced are being done so with the typical methods of production. But at some point, you reach this precipice where that is no longer true and the energy production that is being typically used from oil and gas goes down. They're affected by it. So they have, in a capitalistic system in their mindset, we don't want to be adversely affected by that. We need to ensure that our profits are maintained. And how are we going to ensure that our profits are maintained? Has nothing to do with the environment. Has everything to do with our profits being maintained. Yeah, I think so, oil and gas. Shane, am I wrong? What are your thoughts?
I think, oil and gas are the two big ones. You could also see some parts of the farming industry starting to push back depending on exactly what the Green New Deal contains. If it would contain provisions for like restricting the number of cattle, that's the big thing that comes to mind. And also, to a much smaller extent, vehicle manufacturers who are admittedly already making the switch in many cases to, battery-powered cars, away from fossil fuel-powered cars. They're already making that switch, but for the ones who haven't and for the models of those that haven't, if there are provisions that seek to limit that, then they're going to have to invest in it. But by far, the largest pushback would definitely come from oil and gas. Will, I heard, are you still on the line there? I heard you trying to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to mention sort of like automobiles too. Put me in a mind for that. Cities right now are built for with parking lots and roads for cars and to make GMC and Ford money basically, and not for human health, where we could install bike paths through scenic forest paths or whatever. I don't know. So I was just going to mention that.
Agreed. I'm going to throw in one of my random quirks. Some of their politics I disagree with, but there's this movement, this sort of political and aesthetic movement called solar punk, which is basically reimagining a society with far more green influences and with an anti-corporocratic and to some extent an anti-governmental bit to it too. But this idea of changing the nature of architecture, changing the nature of cities, and changing the way that we live so that we're more enmeshed with nature on a regular basis, it's not just good for your immune systems. It would also be good for your mind and your society and probably your relationships. There are cases people make. Urban planning isn't exactly an issue of mine. I find it interesting, but I'm not a wonk on this stuff. But the way that we build our cities, literally the way that we have chosen the vast majority of populations around the world, the way that we choose to live together, you could do it better and more naturally and more organically, so that you had sort of natural hubs where people come together, and they're not the mall, for instance. They're outside, and yeah, of course you do see that in many cities. But I would argue more is going to be better when it comes to this. We've still got time for, I think, about one more call. If anybody wants to join us, 202-521-1320.
1,000%
One last
agree
thing
with
that I would bring in here.
I was just going to say I agree with that.
Nuclear energy. Yeah, nuclear energy too, man. I mean, I'm pretty sure we agree on this one as well. Even, fusion would be good, but I would argue just go ahead with fission while we have it. It's still better than fossil fuels, way better, and, less intermittent than solar or wind.
The solar power one is a little, the nuclear one is a little dicey for me. I mean, France got rid of theirs, especially after the Fukushima disaster. And I question whether or not it's needed. But look, I do think in the same way that we took the Manhattan Project, we could be doing projects like that. It doesn't have to be for things of war. It could also be things of, life and health. Like, how are we going to ensure that we have fusion energy to make it through for the next generation, et cetera, et cetera? Why does it have to just be, how do we make a nuclear bomb to decimate Japan, as opposed to, how do we make fusion energy so we don't necessarily have this dirty energy going about? Why isn't that the standard? Like sometimes I don't quite understand the oddity and the ways that we function and the way that we think. The moment that you do a Manhattan Project, it seems that it sets the precedent for any other project that you need that's a big, big project. Looks like you would have just rolled into the next one. All right, what else do we need to solve? Let's keep this up. What does it matter? You have the money and expense, the power to do that stuff. Why don't you just do it? It's just the natural thing of doing it. I don't quite get that. I just think to myself, the moment that you solve something like a nuclear bomb and you split the atom, Looks like you'll be feeling yourself, thinking to yourself, what's the next project? And you keep it moving. So I feel you with the fission. Fair enough. But my thought is, if we can get fusion, I mean, and there's all sorts of tactics for it. I mean, there's the thing using sound. There's the thing trying to use electromagnetic fields. There's all sorts of ways of trying to pull it off. And I guess my point is having a huge amount of resources invested into it, where the government is working to make that work in the same way that we did the Manhattan Project. I don't see why those things and those large scientific projects can't also be done. I don't even care if you have it in secret. Don't even care. All things being equal, I prefer to be out.
An acquaintance of mine has this idea, you try to explain why you don't see intelligent life out in the universe. Of course, maybe we do, and I know we keep coming back to this, but try to explain why you don't see it out there in the universe. He has this idea that different civilizations hit the uranium barrier. They hit this ceiling where they discover nuclear energy. They start to harness its power. They also discover simultaneously nuclear weaponry, and then they just self-implode as they bomb each other to death, which is about as cynical a theory as you can have. But it's one explanation.
Well, see, that's interesting, right? I mean, because you have some civilizations that this doesn't occur to them to behave this way. Like for example, something small. We make certain assumptions. Like in our houses, we have different rooms in a house. Why do we have different rooms in a house? Why do we assume that the kids are going to be in their own room? Or why do we assume that the kids need privacy? Why do we assume any of that stuff? We're social animals. Why are we assuming it? I'm making the point. It is an assumption. We make all sorts of assumptions
that
we
room,
think.
Jamarl.
Yeah.
Get out of my room. Well, no, but I mean, it's true. It's true. And if you live, for instance, if you live in a yurt, if you live in a single room structure and everybody lives and sleeps in the same room, you do have that. And different cultures, have different boundaries and definitions when it comes to this stuff. But I for one like my privacy. I like my room. Anyway, we need to go to a break. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back tomorrow. I want to thank Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, all of our listeners, all of our guests, all of our callers, Engineer Andre, and thank you for listening. Be back in the morning, folks. Have a great day. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Really good show today. Really interesting show today. Look, I'll just say this, and I'll say this just as a note for pretty much anybody that comes onto the show or is interested in coming onto the show at any particular point going forward in the future. If you make an argument and I disagree with that argument, there's nothing wrong with the disagreement. And if you're coming onto a show like this, you have to, on some level, expect that you're going to get pushback for a position, whether you do or whether you don't. And that pushback can come in all sorts of ways. It can come in ways you don't necessarily expect, and it may come in ways where the person, just disagrees with you on. If you are given space to make your argument, if you're given opportunity to make your argument, can't complain. Period. If you say something and I am trying to slow you down because I disagree with some of the premises that you're assuming, you can't get mad. The show is literally called Fault Lines. And those fault lines aren't areas where everybody is just kumbaya and everybody agrees. They're going to be areas of disagreement. It is at the basis of the show. And it is a bizarre case for me when people take this tenor as if they're not going to be disagreed with, or as if, oh, how dare you disagree with the position that I'm making. Dude, it's named Fault Lines. Get over it. And if you don't necessarily like your position challenged, that means you need to stay in your room and talk to yourself with other people that agree with you. This will not be the show for that. I am going to say like, I am going to say share, I am going to say subscribe and all that good stuff. Guys, if you dig it, definitely hit the like button and definitely share it. Thanks all. I'll see you guys a little bit later today.